I've always loved road trips. There's something intoxicating about the freedom of the open highway, the hum of tires on asphalt, the promise of adventure stretching out just beyond the horizon. This trip, though, would be different. I was traveling alone for the first time, heading to a cabin I'd rented deep in the woods of northern Michigan. A week of solitude and silence to reset my mind. That was the plan. The first time I saw him was at a gas station just outside of Toledo. I was filling up the tank when a man emerged from the store carrying a cup of coffee and a newspaper. He looked to be in his 50s, with a weathered face and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. As he walked to his car, a battered, rust-red pickup truck, he glanced my way and smiled. It was a polite, fleeting thing, the kind of smile you might offer a stranger without much thought. I smiled back. An hour later, I passed his truck on the highway. He was driving in the right lane, slower than most of the traffic, and I barely gave him a second glance as I sped by. It wasn't until I stopped at a diner a few hours later that I noticed him again. He was sitting in a booth near the window, sipping coffee and reading the same newspaper. When he saw me walk in, he tipped his hat in greeting. It felt odd, but not alarming. Small towns, I figured. People here probably weren't used to strangers, and maybe he was just being friendly. I ordered a sandwich to go, eager to get back on the road. But as I waited at the counter, I caught him watching me. Not in an overtly creepy way, more like he was studying me, trying to place me. I tried to shrug it off, but the unease lingered as I pulled back onto the highway. The cabin was tucked into a grove of tall pines, a rustic A-frame that looked like something out of a postcard. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in and relax. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes every creak of the floorboards sound like thunder. The next morning, I decided to explore a nearby hiking trail. It was a beautiful, overgrown path that wound its way through the forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and moss. I hadn't seen another soul all morning, so when I rounded a bend and saw someone up ahead, I froze. It was the man from the gas station. He was standing just off the trail, staring into the woods as if he hadn't noticed me. I debated turning around, but then he turned and waved, his face lighting up with recognition. "Small world," he said, his voice carrying easily through the still air. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here." I forced a smile and mumbled something about the weather before hurrying past him. My skin prickled as I walked away, the sensation of being watched lingering long after I'd left him behind. I told myself it was nothing. Coincidences happen, right? That night, I sat on the cabin's porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear night sky. I sipped wine and listened to the crackle of the fire pit, letting the calmness of the moment wash over me. But then, just as I was about to head inside, I noticed something strange. There, on the edge of the treeline, was a figure. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but I knew it was him. He stood perfectly still, as if he were part of the forest itself, and when I blinked, he was gone. My heart raced as I locked the cabin door and checked all the windows. The rational part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe it wasn't him at all. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning, I decided to leave. The peace I'd been searching for had been replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. As I packed up the car, I felt eyes on me again. I turned slowly, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The drive home was uneventful, and by the time I reached my apartment, the whole experience felt like a strange, unsettling dream. For weeks, I convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that it had all been harmless. Then one day, a package arrived on my doorstep. No return address, just my name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was a newspaper, folded open to an article about a missing woman. Her picture stared up at me, a smiling, dark-haired woman who looked eerily familiar. My stomach twisted as I read the headline. She'd gone missing from a hiking trail, the same trail I'd been on, the same day I'd been there. Beneath the newspaper was a note, written on a torn scrap of paper. 3 words, "You were lucky." I called the police immediately, but there was little they could do. The man from the gas station. If he even was the same man, was just a blurry figure in my memory now, a phantom who had melted back into the shadows. I changed my locks, installed cameras, and tried to move on, but the fear never quite left me. Every time I'm alone, every time I catch a stranger watching me for a second too long, I wonder, was it him? Is he still out there, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to cross his path? Whoever you are, let's not meet. It was the quiet that gave it away, a silence too still to be natural, like the air held its breath every time he entered the room. We used to talk endlessly, our conversations leaping from one subject to the next, like children skipping stones across a lake. Now, the space between us was filled with a cold, suffocating void. He sat across from me, scrolling on his phone, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I didn't ask who he was texting. I already knew the answer would be a lie. The first sign wasn't anything dramatic. It was the absence of small things. He stopped asking me about my day, stopped laughing at the jokes he used to find hilarious. I caught him wearing a shirt I'd never seen before, one that fit him a little too well, its sharp creases and clean lines at odds with his usual worn hoodies. It was on sale, he said when I asked, but he avoided my eyes, the way someone avoids stepping on a crack in the pavement. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that everyone has moods, that not every little change meant something. But there was a new rhythm to his life, one that didn't include me. He started leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home later at night. Once, I asked if we could have dinner together, just the two of us. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "I've got a work thing." The words felt rehearsed, like a line from a play he'd performed 100 times. The turning point came on a Sunday morning when I noticed his car keys were missing. He hadn't said anything about going out, but when I looked outside, the driveway was empty. Hours passed before he returned, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Just driving around," he said with a shrug. "Needed to clear my head." He kissed my forehead, a gesture that once felt intimate but now seemed calculated, like a magician's distraction before the real trick. The cracks widened. One night, I found a receipt on the kitchen counter, a charge from a restaurant we'd never been to. "Must have been someone at work using my card," he said when I showed him. His tone was casual, almost bored, as though the lie wasn't worth the effort of making it convincing. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, watching from the shadows as his life unfolded in ways I couldn't understand. He laughed at texts that weren't from me. He left for long walks he never used to take. His smile, rare as it was, belonged to someone else. I spent hours replaying our conversations, searching for the moment I'd lost him. But it wasn't a single moment. It was a series of subtle shifts, like the tide pulling away from the shore. Then came the night I found the note. It was tucked into the pocket of his jacket, a crumpled scrap of paper with a name and a phone number written in neat, looping handwriting. My hands shook as I stared at it, the words blurring together. I thought about confronting him, about demanding the truth. But deep down, I already knew. The truth was a storm that had been building for months, and I wasn't sure I could withstand its force. The next morning, I followed him. I told myself it was wrong, that I should trust him, but curiosity had taken root in my chest, twisting and growing until it was impossible to ignore. He drove across town to a cafe, where he sat at a corner table, waiting. A woman joined him, her smile radiant as she leaned across the table. They talked animatedly, their hands brushing occasionally. He looked at her the way he used to look at me, and I felt my stomach churn. When he came home that night, he kissed me on the cheek and asked what was for dinner. His casualness was a dagger, sharp and cruel. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I began to withdraw, matching his distance with my own. I stopped asking him about his day, stopped laughing at his jokes. He didn't seem to notice. Weeks passed like this, the silence between us growing louder. Then, one evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I placed the note in front of him. His face drained of color as he stared at it. "What's this?" he asked, his voice strained. "You tell me," I said, my tone colder than I'd intended. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize, either. He just sat there, staring at the note like it held the answers to questions he couldn't ask. "I'm sorry," he finally said, but the words rang hollow. They weren't meant for me. The next day, he packed his things and left. He didn't beg for forgiveness or promise to change. He simply walked out, leaving behind the life we'd built together. For weeks, I wandered through the empty rooms of our apartment, haunted by memories of what we'd once been. But as the days turned into months, I began to feel lighter. The silence, once oppressive, became peaceful. I learned to trust myself again, to listen to the instincts I'd ignored for so long. And while the scars of betrayal will always be there, they are a reminder of my resilience, proof that even in the face of heartbreak, I can survive. The first thing I noticed was the vase. It sat on the coffee table in my living room, squat and unremarkable, a cheap piece I'd picked up at a thrift store. For as long as I could remember, it had held a cluster of fake daisies, the kind with stiff plastic stems and petals that never quite mimic nature. That's why it caught my attention. It wasn't the same vase. This one was taller, narrower, with a pattern of swirling blue and gold that shimmered faintly in the light. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the discrepancy. Had I swapped it out and forgotten? Maybe someone had left it there. But who? I lived alone, and I wasn't exactly the type to host surprise visitors. Still, the human mind is good at smoothing over cracks. I shrugged, chalked it up to forgetfulness, and went about my evening. It wasn't until later, when I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, that I noticed the mirror. It wasn't mine. My mirror was a simple rectangle with a thin, chipped wooden frame. This one was round, bordered by ornate carvings of flowers and vines, and the reflection was too sharp, too vivid. My eyes darted from the mirror to the sink, then to the tiles on the floor, which had subtly changed from beige to a muted shade of green. Something had shifted, something I couldn't explain. I touched the wall, running my fingers along the cool surface as if to prove it was real. The tiles felt solid under my hand, yet unfamiliar, like they belonged to a stranger's home. My stomach twisted with unease. By the time I returned to the living room, the vase was gone. The daisies, too. In their place was a heavy, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with an intricate geometric design that seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat. I didn't touch it. I didn't dare. The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. I sat down slowly, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was imagining things. Stress, overwork. There were 1,000 reasons my mind might be playing tricks on me. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The room felt wrong in a way that was too tangible, too vivid to dismiss. It was like someone had taken my life, my home, and rearranged it piece by piece while I wasn't looking. The television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, white noise hissing through the speakers. I grabbed the remote and clicked it off, but a moment later, it flickered back to life. The static was replaced by an image, my living room, shown from a high angle. It was a live feed. I could see myself sitting on the couch, staring at the screen. My pulse thundered in my ears. I looked around wildly, searching for a camera, but there was nothing. No devices, no wires, no explanation. The image on the television zoomed in slowly, focusing on my face. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The screen went black, and a single word appeared in white text. Notice. Notice what? I tried to think, to focus, but my thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion. I stood up, pacing the room, running my hands through my hair. The leather-bound book on the table was gone now, replaced by a silver pocket watch. It was open, the hands spinning wildly, faster than they should have been able to move. I slammed it shut and shoved it aside, but the sound of ticking lingered in my ears. The house was shifting around me, subtly at first. The light switch moved from one side of the wall to the other. The curtains changed from navy to white, but soon it was undeniable. The couch stretched longer, then shrank smaller. The ceiling grew higher, the walls pressed closer. I felt like I was standing inside a kaleidoscope, the pieces of my reality shattering and reassembling in dizzying patterns. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but when I flung it open, the hallway outside wasn't my building's hallway. It wasn't even a hallway. It It was a vast expanse of black, punctuated by distant pinpricks of light. Stars, I thought numbly, though they seemed too sharp, too close, as if the universe itself had been compressed and folded until it fit just beyond the threshold. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding. When I turned back, the living room was gone. I stood in an empty void, the floor beneath me smooth and featureless. The ticking sound grew louder, reverberating through the emptiness. I shouted, screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the void. And then, just as suddenly, everything snapped back into place. I was in my living room again, sitting on the couch. The vase with the fake daisies was on the coffee table. The clock on the wall showed the same time it always did. Baxter, my cat, purred softly from his perch on the windowsill. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. A vivid dream, perhaps, or a hallucination. But when I glanced at the corner of the room, my blood turned to ice. The leather-bound book was back, open. Its pages were blank, except for a single line scrawled in the center of the first page. You are the anomaly. I closed the book, my hands trembling, and shoved it under the couch. But I could feel it there, pulsing faintly, as if it were alive. The vase on the table flickered, shifting briefly into the swirling blue and gold before returning to its familiar form. The television turned on again, static crackling on the screen. This time, I didn't stay to watch. I was not the kind of person who struck up conversations with strangers, but that afternoon, I did. It was a lazy Sunday at the park, and the air was heavy with the kind of stillness that made everything feel oddly dreamlike. I had just settled onto a bench, flipping through a novel while sipping an iced coffee, when he appeared. He wasn't remarkable, just a guy in his 30s with shaggy brown hair and a slightly crooked smile. What caught my attention was his dog, a beautiful Dalmatian with a scar that curved over its left eye like a crescent moon. "Quite the dog you've got there," I said, gesturing toward it. He smiled, polite but restrained, and said, "Yeah, this is Apollo. He's a rescue." The dog wagged its tail lazily, as if acknowledging the compliment. We talked for a few minutes about dogs, the weather, and the state of the park. Then he nodded and walked off toward the playground. The encounter was brief, ordinary, and unmemorable. At least, that's what I told myself. It wasn't until later that I realized how quickly a sense of normalcy could be stripped away. The next time I saw him was at my gym 2 days later. I was finishing a set of squats when I spotted him near the treadmills, Apollo nowhere in sight. He wasn't working out, just standing near the water fountain, scrolling on his phone. My stomach twisted slightly, not in fear, but in confusion. The city wasn't small, but it also wasn't enormous. It wasn't impossible that someone who lived nearby might frequent the same places, but there was something odd about it. His presence didn't fit. He wasn't dressed for the gym, and he wasn't interacting with anyone. Still, I said nothing. I didn't even make eye contact. I finished my workout, avoiding his direction, and left as casually as possible. The walk home felt longer than usual. The third time was harder to brush off. I was grabbing groceries after work when I saw him again, standing at the end of an aisle. He wasn't shopping. He was just there, leaning against a cart with an empty basket. My skin prickled. He didn't look at me, but he didn't need to. The sheer improbability of running into someone 3 times in a week, in completely different places, made me feel like I'd stepped into a scenario I couldn't quite comprehend. I left without finishing my shopping list, opting for the self-checkout just to get out of there faster. That night, I stayed up late, replaying every detail of our brief interactions. Had I imagined the familiarity in his presence? Was I being ridiculous? And why hadn't he even acknowledged me the second or third time? Surely, if he remembered me, he'd have said something, even just a nod of recognition. But he hadn't, and that was what made it feel worse. Like I was the only one seeing these connections while he remained oblivious. Or pretended to. By the time a week passed, I'd convinced myself that I was overthinking it. Then, the notes started showing up. The first one was tucked into my mailbox, a folded piece of plain white paper with the words, "Nice to meet you," scrawled in black ink. No name, no signature. I told myself it was random, probably a mistake. But 2 days later, another appeared on my windshield. This one read, "You look tired today." My chest tightened. The kind of tired that someone could see through a window, or tired from walking around. It was vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to mean too much. The next night, I came home to find a small gift bag hanging from my doorknob. Inside was a dog leash, black and unassuming, with a tag attached that read, "For Max." I froze. Max was my dog. My very real, very friendly German shepherd who never went out without me. The leash was brand new. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my brain spinning through every possible explanation. A neighbor? A friend? But no one I knew had mentioned leaving it, and something about the note, so direct, so pointed, made me think this wasn't from anyone I trusted. I started locking my doors obsessively after that, double-checking the windows and keeping Max close anytime we went out. Still, I saw him again, twice in 1 week. Once near the dog park, though he didn't have Apollo with him this time, and once outside my office building, leaning against the wall and reading a newspaper. Each time, he seemed disinterested, unaware of my existence. But it was hard to believe it was all coincidental when I knew there was no reason for him to be in either place. The breaking point came a week later, when I woke up in the middle of the night to Max growling low and sharp. My apartment was silent except for the sound of his nails clicking on the hardwood floor as he paced back and forth near the door. I checked the peephole, heart hammering, and saw nothing. But when I opened the door a crack, there it was, another note. This one wasn't folded neatly like the others. It was crumpled, scrawled in the same familiar handwriting. "You're just so interesting." My hands shook as I locked the door and dialed the police. They arrived quickly but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no suspicious individuals lurking nearby. The officer who spoke to me was sympathetic but unhelpful. "Could be a prank," he said. "Let us know if it escalates." Escalates. As if this wasn't already a violation. A shadow creeping into the corners of my life and turning every moment into something sinister. For days, nothing happened. The notes stopped, and I didn't see him. The absence was almost worse. It left me constantly waiting, wondering when the next encounter would come. And then, as suddenly as it began, it seemed to end. Weeks passed without incident. I told myself it was over, that whoever he was, he'd moved on. But yesterday, I found a photo slipped under my door. It was a picture of me sitting on the park bench that first day, smiling at Apollo. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was his reflection in the park fountain, staring right at me. For years, I lived in a second-floor apartment above a used bookstore that always smelled faintly of paper and mildew. The floors creaked, the windows never shut properly, and the radiator hissed like an angry cat. Still, it was mine, and I liked the quirks. The apartment had charm, until the noises started. It began with the sound of shuffling in the hallway outside my door. It was subtle at first, like someone pacing in slippers, but when I checked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. No neighbors coming home late, no maintenance guy. Just the dim yellow glow of the flickering light bulb. The shuffling continued every night for a week, always around midnight. Then, something changed. I came home one evening to find a smell in the stairwell leading up to my door. It wasn't the usual scent of old books and damp wood. This was different, sharper, chemical, like rust mixed with vinegar. It was faint but persistent, and as I unlocked my door, the smell grew stronger. The air inside my apartment felt stale, like the windows had been shut for years. I checked the kitchen, thinking I'd left something to spoil, but everything seemed fine. I chalked it up to paranoia and cracked a window. Later that night, as I lay in bed with my laptop, I heard it again. Not the pacing this time, something heavier. A thud, faint but deliberate, coming from directly above me. I froze. My building didn't have an attic, just the roof, and there was no way anyone could get up there without a ladder. The noise came again. Thud, thud, like footsteps, slow and heavy. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but the next morning, I found something strange on my bedroom ceiling. There were smudges, thin, dark streaks in the plaster, as if someone had dragged their fingertips across it. I tried scrubbing it off, but the marks wouldn't budge. I told myself it was water damage, some trick of shadows, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The following night, I decided to stay awake and keep watch. Midnight came, and with it, the shuffling. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung open my door, ready to catch whoever was messing with me. The hallway was empty, but the smell hit me, a rancid, metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My neighbor's door creaked open a crack. Mr. Lindell, the old man who lived across the hall, peered out. His milky eyes squinted at me. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "Hear what?" His voice was dry, raspy. "The shuffling, the footsteps. Someone's been pacing the hall at night." He frowned. "Footsteps? No one's been up here but you." Before I could respond, he added, almost absently, "Watch the shadows, boy. They're thicker than they seem." He shut the door, and I was left standing in the hallway, his words buzzing in my ears. I didn't sleep much after that. The noises escalated. The pacing outside my door turned into scratching, faint at first but growing more insistent. One night, the scratching was accompanied by a low whispering, just on the other side of the door. It wasn't a voice I could understand. It wasn't even a language, just wet, garbled sounds, like someone choking on their own words. I bought a lock for my bedroom door after I found the marks on my ceiling had spread. The dark streaks branched out like veins, reaching down toward the walls. The smell was worse, too, so strong that I started sleeping with a damp towel pressed over my nose. Then came the night when everything fell apart. I woke up to the sound of movement, not in the hallway, not above me, but inside my apartment. My bedroom door rattled as if someone was testing the knob. I reached for my phone, but the moment I touched it, the light from the screen dimmed, flickered, and died. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely able to force the words out. The rattling stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than the air before a storm. Slowly, the door creaked open. There was no one there, but the shadows were wrong. They weren't cast by anything in the room. They seemed alive, shifting and pooling like spilled ink. The smell was overwhelming now, stinging my eyes and throat. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my chest. The shadows moved toward me, and as they crept closer, I realized they weren't just shadows. Faces began to form, hollow-eyed, gaunt, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. They pressed toward me, growing darker, denser, until the room was consumed. Just before everything went black, I felt something cold and slick wrap around my ankle, dragging me toward the edge of the bed. When I woke up, it was morning. The light streamed through the window, and everything was as it should be, except for the marks on my ceiling. They were gone. My apartment no longer smelled like rust or vinegar, and the air was light, fresh. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed it all. But when I went to open my front door, I found something waiting. A dark, hand-shaped smudge was smeared across the doorknob. Beneath it, in shaky, jagged letters, someone, or something, had written, "Don't leave. They'll follow." I packed a bag and left anyway. I didn't tell anyone why I was moving. I didn't want to explain the scratches I found on my skin every morning or the whispers I sometimes heard in my empty apartment. I didn't want to talk about the shadows that followed me out of the building, stretching long and dark across the pavement, no matter where the sun was. It wasn't the kind of thing you notice right away. If anything, the strangeness slipped in quietly, like a draft through an unseen crack, unsettling but untraceable. I wouldn't have thought much of it if it hadn't been for that morning at the cafe, a moment so unremarkable, it should have already faded into the blur of my routine. The man was sitting at the corner table, wearing a deep green scarf despite the early summer heat. He was stirring a cup of coffee that looked untouched, staring out the window with the kind of focus reserved for serious thoughts or serious regrets. I might not have noticed him at all if not for the odd sensation that washed over me when I passed by to grab my drink. It wasn't déjà vu, exactly. It was closer to the feeling of walking into a room and forgetting why you came, like something important had slipped just out of reach. He looked at me, just for a second, and nodded as though we shared an understanding. "Nice scarf," I said, mostly out of reflex. His smile was faint, enigmatic. "You'll see." It wasn't until later that I realized he hadn't answered my question, though I couldn't have said what I had asked him in the first place. The first shift happened that night. My clock was blinking when I got home, its display frozen at 4:17. The power must have gone out, I thought. Annoying, but hardly unusual. I reset the time, made dinner, and turned in early, exhausted from a day that felt inexplicably heavier than normal. When I woke up, it was 4:17 again. The same moment, unbudged, as if my clock had refused to move forward with me. My phone told a different story. 7:22 a.m., Wednesday. I chalked it up to a mechanical glitch, shook off the eerie feeling, and got ready for work. By the time I left the house, I'd almost forgotten the whole thing, until I stepped onto the subway platform. There he was again, the man with the green scarf. Same table in the cafe, same distant expression, except there was no cafe now, just a bench on the platform that hadn't been there yesterday. I hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge him or walk away. He solved the dilemma by turning toward me and saying, "It's happening faster than I thought." "Excuse me?" I replied, too startled to come up with anything better. "You're a quick learner. That's good. Most aren't." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a stopwatch, the kind that looked like it belonged to a track coach or a magician. He held it up, tapping its face with a long, thin finger. "Time doesn't like being watched. Did you know that?" I wanted to say something, anything, but my brain was caught on the strangeness of the moment, trying to puzzle out whether this was a joke, a scam, or something else entirely. He clicked the stopwatch. The world stuttered. I don't have better words for it. The subway, the people, the sounds, they all stuttered, like a scratched CD skipping the same beat over and over. One moment I was on the platform. The next, I was standing in the middle of my apartment. My shoes were gone. My jacket hung neatly on the rack, though I didn't remember taking it off. My phone said it was still Wednesday, but the time blinked back at me like it couldn't quite make up its mind. 12:03, 8:14, 5:17. The man's voice lingered in my head. Time doesn't like being watched. The next few days, or what I thought were days, bent in ways I couldn't explain. I'd be at work reviewing a report and look up to find myself sitting in the park, pigeons scattered at my feet. I'd reach for my coffee mug in the kitchen and suddenly be back in the cafe, staring at an untouched cup that wasn't mine. The man with the green scarf was everywhere. At the grocery store, in the corner of a meeting room, reflected in the darkened windows of the subway. He never approached me, never spoke, but his presence seemed to pulse at the edges of my awareness like a migraine building in the distance. The worst of it was the silence. No one else seemed to notice. My coworkers went about their routines. My neighbors waved hello. My phone still buzzed with notifications. I even called my mother once, desperate to anchor myself in some shred of normalcy, only to hear her voice crackle with static as she told me, "You'll figure it out, sweetheart." It wasn't her voice at all, not really. By the time I confronted him again, I'd stopped trying to pretend things were fine. It was on a train that wasn't moving, the windows showing nothing but darkness. He was sitting across from me, the green scarf gone now, replaced by a dark red one. He looked younger, though his eyes carried the weight of something timeless. "What's happening to me?" I demanded, though my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "You're unraveling," he said simply, as though that explained everything. "It's what happens when you start to notice the seams." "The seams of what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out the stopwatch. This time, he didn't click it. Instead, he handed it to me. "You can keep fighting it if you want, or you can stop. The choice is yours." "What does it stop?" I asked, clutching the cold metal in my hand. He smiled faintly, a flicker of sympathy passing through his expression. "Everything." I wanted to ask more, but the train shuddered, and he was gone. Only the stopwatch remained, its face blank except for the faintest impression of 4:17, like an echo pressed into glass. Now, every time I see a clock, I feel its eyes on me. Time watches me as much as I watch it, daring me to press the button. I don't know what will happen if I do. Maybe everything will end. Maybe nothing will. But the seams are growing thinner, and every day feels closer to slipping out of reach. I think I'm beginning to understand what he meant. Time doesn't like being watched, but it likes being forgotten even less. The day after I returned from my business trip, I found a shoelace in my refrigerator. It was an ordinary lace, black, slightly frayed at the ends, but it didn't belong to me. I only owned slip-on shoes, a preference born out of laziness. I stared at it for a long time before tossing it into the trash. It felt intrusive, though I couldn't explain why. Later, I told myself I must have tracked it in somehow, maybe on my bag or jacket. That explanation didn't sit well, but it kept my mind from spiraling, at least for a while. 2 nights later, my dining room chair was missing. The other 3 sat in their usual places, but the 4th, the one I always used, was gone. I searched the entire apartment, under the bed, in the closet, even in the bathroom. It wasn't anywhere. When I finally gave up, I sat on the floor where the chair should have been and ate dinner with my plate balanced on my knees. I texted my friend Chris, mostly to make myself feel less ridiculous. Me, you ever lose a chair before? Chris, lose it? Like it walked off? Me, no idea. Maybe my neighbor needed a loaner and broke in? Chris, definitely. Or the chair mafia. They're ruthless. His jokes made me laugh, but I couldn't stop thinking about the chair. I even locked my bedroom door before I went to bed that night, as though that would keep the absurdity out. By the next morning, the chair was back. It sat in its usual place at the dining table, perfectly aligned with the others. There was a faint scuff on one leg that I didn't remember being there before. I checked my door and window locks, even though I already knew they hadn't been tampered with. I stood in the living room for a long time, looking at that chair. It stared back, unassuming and silent. More small changes followed. My shampoo bottle moved from the shower to the windowsill. A framed photo of my parents disappeared from the wall and turned up 2 days later in the pantry, wedged between a box of cereal and a jar of peanut butter. My set of measuring cups inexplicably went missing, and I only found them weeks later, stacked neatly in the freezer. It wasn't just the objects, though. I began noticing faint smells, with smoke, salt water, lavender, lingering in the apartment at odd hours. None of them matched anything I owned. I bought a second lock for the front door, even though I was already sure this wasn't about locks. Friends were sympathetic at first, jokingly blaming my quirky ghost. But as the weeks went on and I kept bringing it up, their amusement gave way to concern. Chris suggested I keep a journal to document what was happening, though his tone made it clear he thought the exercise would prove I was imagining things. I started the journal anyway, partly out of desperation and partly because I had no better ideas. One night, I woke up to the sound of scraping. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic noise coming from the kitchen. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. It stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming, and reached for my phone. The screen lit up, casting a cold glow across the room. The scraping stopped. I held my breath, waiting. When I finally got up the courage to investigate, I found nothing out of place. The silence was suffocating as I checked every room, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. It wasn't until I returned to my bedroom that I saw it. A single strand of long, dark hair on my pillow. My hair was short and light brown. I didn't touch the strand. I just stared at it, feeling something cold and sharp claw its way into my chest. The next morning, I left the apartment and checked into a hotel. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with the growing sense that I wasn't alone. I didn't tell the hotel staff why I was there. I just handed over my credit card and retreated to the room. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. That night, I locked the hotel door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. I told myself I was safe, that whatever had been happening wouldn't follow me. But when I woke up the next morning, the chair was gone. The hotel room was silent, sunlight streaming through the curtains, but the emptiness was overwhelming. The chair wasn't under the handle or in the corner where I'd put it. It wasn't anywhere in the room. On the nightstand, though, was my missing journal. I knew I hadn't brought it. It was open to a page I didn't remember writing, the words scrawled in a jagged, uneven hand. You can't leave. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't even stop to put on my shoes. I bolted out the door and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My journal was still sitting on the nightstand when I sped away. I haven't gone back to the hotel or the apartment since. I haven't told anyone the full story, But sometimes, when I'm trying to fall asleep in whatever new city I found myself in, I hear it again. That faint scraping sound. And I know, deep down, that the chair is still waiting for me. I've lived in this town my entire life. I know its rhythms, the way the shadows shift under the elms at noon, how the air thickens before a storm. So when things began to change, I wasn't sure if it was the town or me unraveling. It started subtly, like a dissonant note in a familiar song. One night, I noticed my bedroom wall seemed darker than usual. Not just shadowed, but stained, as if the light couldn't reach certain corners. At first, I thought it was the cheap paint or a trick of the dim bulb overhead. But when I reached out to touch the wall, it felt damp. The sensation made my stomach churn, though my fingers came away dry. I didn't turn the light off that night. The town itself seemed untouched at first. I walked the same streets, greeted the same neighbors. But there was something in their eyes that felt distant, as if they weren't seeing me but something just past my shoulder. One afternoon, I stopped by the corner store for milk, and old Mr. Darnell, who ran the register, didn't smile at me like he usually did. Instead, he placed the carton down with a deliberate slowness, his fingers lingering on it. "You're looking tired, Claire," he said, though I hadn't told him my name. His lips quirked in what should have been a reassuring grin, but his teeth looked wrong, too even, too white. I left the milk behind. The next day, the cracks in reality widened. The library, my safe haven since childhood, was the same brick building it had always been. But when I stepped inside, the smell of paper and dust had vanished, replaced by the sharp tang of ozone. The shelves were there, lined with books, but their spines were blank. I pulled one down and flipped through the pages, empty. All of them. The librarian, Miss Peters, sat at her desk, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Looking for something you lost?" she asked. Her voice was clipped, too precise, like she'd rehearsed the question but didn't understand its meaning. "I'm just browsing," I muttered, backing out of the library as quickly as I could. That night, I dreamed of faces, hundreds of them, staring at me from the dark. They were pale and featureless, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly, as if they were trying to tell me something I couldn't hear. When I woke up, the room was ice cold, though the heater was humming. My phone sat on the nightstand, its screen glowing faintly. I hadn't touched it, but a message was open, its text stark against the black background. "Do you see it yet?" My breath hitched, and I grabbed the phone, deleting the message in a panic. Who sent it? How did it get there? I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, the faint ticking of the clock sounding more like a countdown. By the end of the week, the changes had grown more personal. My childhood home, where my parents still lived, no longer felt like a refuge. The doorbell was different, a chime instead of the familiar ding. And my mom opened the door with a brightness that felt rehearsed. "Claire, it's been so long," she said, as if I hadn't seen her just a week ago. I followed her into the living room, where the furniture had been rearranged. "When did you move the couch?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked puzzled. "What do you mean? It's always been there." I didn't argue, but my eyes lingered on the space where the couch had been, now occupied by a low table I didn't recognize. My dad sat in his recliner, staring at the muted TV. The screen was showing static, but he didn't seem to notice. When I called his name, he turned his head slowly, his movements stiff, unnatural. "Good to see you, kiddo," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I left before dinner, claiming I wasn't feeling well. Back at my apartment, I barricaded the door with a chair and paced the floor, trying to piece it all together. Was I losing my mind? Or was the world itself breaking apart, one fragment at a time? The damp walls, the blank books, the stranger in my dad's chair. All of it felt connected, but I couldn't grasp how. I started recording everything, every change, every oddity. My phone filled with voice memos of me describing shadows that moved when they shouldn't, faces in windows that vanished when I turned to look. But the next morning, when I played the recordings back, my voice was missing. All I heard was faint static, like a distant radio signal. The final fracture came on a Sunday. I woke to find my bedroom door open, though I was certain I'd locked it. The chair I'd wedged against it was lying on its side. My apartment felt colder than ever, and the damp smell was stronger now, almost overpowering. In the living room, someone was sitting on my couch. A woman, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, just like mine. My stomach knotted as I realized she was wearing my clothes, down to the worn sweater I'd thrown on the night before. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The woman turned slowly, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was me, or something that looked like me. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and too large for her face. Her lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach those empty eyes. "Do you see it yet?" she asked, her voice soft, lilting. I ran. Out the door, down the stairs, into the freezing night air. I didn't stop until I was halfway across town, standing under a flickering street lamp. But the town was wrong now, too. The streets were empty, the buildings unfamiliar. Every window I passed reflected my face back at me, but in each one, my reflection smiled, though I wasn't. I don't know where I am anymore. I don't know if this is my town, or some version of it twisted beyond recognition. I keep walking, hoping to find someone, anyone, who feels real. But all I see are shadows and reflections. And the worst part? I think they're following me. The house on Thornton Street wasn't haunted in any traditional sense. It didn't have creaking floorboards or ghostly whispers drifting through the halls. No locked doors rattled. No mirrors fogged mysteriously. No apparitions demanded justice for unsolved murders. It was a plain, two-story home with beige siding and a porch swing that tilted slightly to one side. But there was something about it. Something inexplicably heavy, as if the air inside carried more weight than air should. Nobody lived there, not anymore. The last occupant, a man named Harold Pratt, had vanished one spring morning 2 years ago. No moving trucks, no goodbyes, just a half-mowed lawn, an open garage door, and a coffee mug left on the kitchen counter with a pale green circle of mold at the bottom. The neighbors gossiped for a while, as neighbors do, but eventually, the mystery settled into the background like an old scar. On an unremarkable Saturday in January, I found myself standing on the cracked sidewalk outside the house, staring up at its darkened windows. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache when you breathe too hard. My scarf was wound tight, but it didn't stop the chill from creeping into my collar. I hadn't planned on coming here. Thornton Street wasn't exactly on the way to anything. But something about the house had pulled at me ever since I'd moved to the neighborhood last month. Like an itch in the back of my mind, impossible to ignore. I stepped closer. The for sale sign in the yard had tipped sideways, half buried in a patch of frozen dirt. There was no lockbox on the door, no realtor's flyer with glossy pictures of the interior. Just the house, standing silent and indifferent. The gate to the backyard was open, its rusted latch dangling by a single screw. I hesitated, glancing up and down the street. No one was watching. A dog barked in the distance, its echo bouncing between the houses. I pushed the gate open and walked through. The backyard was as ordinary as the front. A skeletal tree in the corner, its branches tangled like veins. A small patio with a grill that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But then I noticed the door. It was in the side of the house, near the foundation. Not a basement door, exactly. It was too small, too narrow, almost like it had been added as an afterthought. The paint was peeling, and the handle was smudged with something dark. For a moment, I thought about turning back, about leaving the house to whatever ghosts of Harold Pratt's life still lingered inside. But the itch was there again, stronger this time, clawing at the edges of my reason. The door wasn't locked. It opened with a groan, revealing a steep set of stairs that plunged into darkness. I pulled out my phone, the flashlight slicing through the gloom, and descended. The air was different down there, thick, metallic, as though the walls were sweating iron. The space was cramped, the ceiling low enough that I had to duck to keep from hitting my head. At first, it looked like a regular basement. Boxes stacked haphazardly in the corners, a laundry sink stained with rust, a single folding chair tipped onto its side. But then I saw the wall. It was made of stone, unlike the rest of the basement's concrete blocks. Rough-hewn, ancient, the the kind of stone that feels out of place in a suburban home. In the center of the wall was a door, or maybe a gate. It was hard to tell. The edges were jagged, as if someone had punched a hole through the stone with their bare hands. And in the middle of the opening, something shimmered. It wasn't light, exactly. More like the memory of light. An afterimage that flickered and pulsed, casting faint shadows on the walls. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The shimmer grew stronger, almost alive, as though it recognized me. My hand twitched toward it, compelled by something I couldn't name. As my fingers brushed the edge of the shimmer, the air shifted. Not just in the basement, everywhere. It was as if the entire world had taken a breath. And then, just as suddenly, it exhaled. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the basement anymore. The space around me was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction. The ground was soft, like moss, but glowed faintly beneath my feet. The sky, or what I assumed was the sky, was a swirling canvas of colors that didn't have names. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, too quick to focus on, like shadows in a dream. A voice broke the silence, low and resonant. "You shouldn't be here." I turned, but there was no one behind me. The voice came again, this time closer. "Turn back, while you can. What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the shapes at the edges of my vision began to move closer. I could see them now, figures, tall and skeletal, their faces obscured by shifting veils of light. They didn't speak, but I felt their presence pressing against me, an unspoken question. "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer. I tried to move, but the ground seemed to hold me in place, soft yet unyielding. The figures circled me, their light growing brighter, hotter, until it burned against my skin. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The figures withdrew, their light fading into the distance. The ground released me, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice returned, quieter now. "Leave, before you bring it with you." "Bring what?" I shouted, but the sky was already fading, the colors dissolving into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the basement. The shimmer in the wall was gone, replaced by smooth stone. My phone lay on the ground, its flashlight still on, casting long shadows across the room. I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door behind me as I stumbled into the backyard. The air felt normal again, crisp and sharp, the kind of cold that belonged to this world. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. The house loomed behind me, silent and unchanging, but I could feel something watching, something waiting. I never went back to Thornton Street. I never told anyone what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the feeling that the air around me is too heavy, too still. And I wonder if I left something behind. Or worse, if I brought something with me. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. I'd been staring out the window, watching the late afternoon light fracture across the glass of the neighboring office building, when I caught the movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, quick, indistinct, disappearing behind the door to the stairwell. A coworker, probably, though I couldn't recall hearing the door open or close. The detail slipped from my mind as soon as it appeared. Work was busy, and the hours blurred together in the way they always did when deadlines were breathing down my neck. I didn't think about it again until the next day, when I passed by the stairwell on my way to grab coffee. The handle was sticky. Not wet, not dirty, just sticky, as though it had been coated with glue and wiped clean before it had a chance to fully dry. I pulled my hand back instinctively, wiping it on my pants. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to know what was behind it. Over the following weeks, the stairwell became something I avoided without meaning to. It wasn't deliberate. I never told myself, "Don't go near it." But I began rerouting my usual paths around the office, taking the long way to meetings or the elevator to skip a single floor. If anyone noticed, they didn't mention it. Why would they? It was just a stairwell. The subtle things started after that. My computer lagged for the first time in years. Not freezing, just pausing, as though it needed to think. A single keystroke would take an extra beat to register, the screen flickering as if startled into motion. I joked to IT about its midlife crisis, and they laughed along, but their faces tensed when I described it. Then there was the email I received from HR, a vague memo about building maintenance and unusual sound complaints. Except the sender wasn't anyone I recognized, and when I checked the directory, the email address didn't exist. I asked around. Nobody else had gotten the memo. By then, I'd started to feel that familiar, creeping sensation that something wasn't right. It was the little things. The way my coworkers stopped mid-sentence sometimes, their eyes flicking just past me before they recovered, like they'd seen someone standing behind me. The way the lights above my desk buzzed faintly, almost imperceptibly, and seemed to flicker only when I looked up. The way my coffee tasted slightly off, like it had been brewed in a pot that had never quite been cleaned. And then, one evening, I was the last one in the office. I hadn't planned on staying late, but the hours had gotten away from me, and by the time I noticed, the sun was already a thin red line on the horizon. The quiet was oppressive. No footsteps, no muffled conversations, not even the distant hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum. Just silence. I told myself to wrap up quickly, but as I was packing my bag, I heard a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint click, but it was enough to freeze me in place. It had come from behind me, near the stairwell. My hand tightened on the strap of my bag. I turned slowly, scanning the empty rows of desks. Nothing. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. Movement. A figure slipping into the stairwell, the door closing silently behind them. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to get in the elevator and go home. But something about the figure, it wasn't just a coworker. It couldn't be. They'd moved wrong, their limbs bending in a way that was almost familiar, but just a shade too fluid, too smooth, like a video sped up and slowed down at the same time. Before I realized it, I was crossing the room, my footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. I reached the stairwell door and hesitated. The handle looked clean, but I could feel its tacky residue before my hand even touched it. The stairwell was dark, the overhead lights flickering faintly as I stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like dust and something faintly metallic. Hello? My voice echoed up and down the concrete shaft, thin and weak. No response. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. Instead, I took a step down, then another. Each footfall sent a hollow thud reverberating through the space, a sound too large for the narrow staircase. The farther I descended, the quieter it became, as though the stairs were absorbing the sound. When I reached the landing below, I saw it, a smear of something dark across the wall, streaked and uneven, as if someone had pressed their hand there and dragged it downward. It wasn't blood, not quite, but it shimmered faintly, catching the light in a way that made my stomach twist. And there, at the bottom of the next flight, a figure stood. I couldn't see their face. They were turned away from me, their shoulders hunched and their head tilted slightly to the side, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. "Excuse me?" My voice cracked. The figure turned slowly, and my breath caught. It was my face. Not a twin. Not someone who looked like me. It was me, but wrong. The eyes were too bright, too large, and the smile that spread across their lips was thin and sharp, like a blade pressed against skin. They didn't speak. They just raised a hand and waved, their movements exaggerated, almost cartoonish. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the edge of the step, and the figure tilted its head farther, its neck bending at an impossible angle. The stairwell lights flickered violently, and in that brief, stuttering darkness, the figure vanished. I didn't remember running back to my desk or grabbing my bag. I didn't remember the elevator ride down or the walk to my car. I only remember sitting in my driveway hours later, the taste of copper on my tongue, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The office was closed the next day. Apparently, there'd been a gas leak, though I didn't smell anything the night before. I tried to call a few coworkers to ask if they'd noticed anything strange, but the numbers rang endlessly before disconnecting. It's been 3 days now. I haven't gone back, but last night, when I looked out my window, I saw someone standing across the street. They waved at me, and this morning, I found a sticky smear on the inside of my front door. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was just a fluke. I was in the middle of a Zoom call, nodding along to my boss's rambling monologue, when I glanced down at my mug. It was supposed to say, "World's okayest employee," a gag gift from my coworker Ellie, but the words were gone. The mug was plain white. I chalked it up to fatigue, or maybe a weird trick of the light. But when I asked Ellie about it later, she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What mug?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "I gave you a cactus for your desk." The next time, it was harder to dismiss. I stepped into my kitchen for breakfast, and everything looked wrong. The counter was empty where my toaster should have been, the fruit bowl was gone, and the magnets on the fridge. Photos of my nieces and a postcard from Paris were replaced with a random assortment of clip art vegetables. I stood there for a long minute, blinking. I hadn't moved anything. I couldn't even remember the last time I rearranged anything in my kitchen. By the time I got home from work that evening, everything was back to normal. The toaster was in its usual spot, the fridge was plastered with familiar faces, and the bowl of apples sat smugly on the counter as if it had never left. After that, the changes came more frequently. They were small at first. Songs on my playlist I'd never downloaded, a book on my shelf with a title I didn't recognize, even though the spine had that telltale crease from being read. But then things started to escalate. I'd see the same guy 3 times in a single day. Once on the bus, once walking past my office building, and again at the coffee shop near my apartment. Always the same green hoodie and headphones. Once, I waved at him, just to see if he'd react, but he didn't even glance my way. One day, I woke up to find my bedroom mirror hanging on the opposite wall. I stared at it for a solid 5 minutes, trying to remember if I'd moved it. Maybe I had, in a late-night burst of energy I'd forgotten about. But no matter how I twisted the thought, it didn't fit. I hadn't touched that mirror since I'd hung it up months ago. I stood in front of it, watching my own face, half expecting it to move differently from me. It didn't. It wasn't long before I stopped questioning it. What was the point? I'd walk into my living room to find the couch flipped the other way, or my phone's lock screen would suddenly show a photo I didn't take, a beach I'd never visited, or a dog I didn't own. I learned to shrug it off. At least the dog was cute. Some days, it felt like reality itself was fraying at the edges. I'd leave work early, sure I was going to miss the bus, only to find it pulling up exactly on time. A few times, I caught myself already knowing what someone was about to say before they said it. Not in the way where you can predict your friend's favorite joke, but word for word, tone and inflection included. Once, I finished an entire conversation with Ellie only to realize I'd already had it the week before, down to her wearing the same earrings. Then there were the people. I swear I'd meet someone for the first time and feel like I'd known them forever. Faces seemed to repeat, like NPCs in a poorly programmed video game. Sometimes I'd see someone I thought I knew, a coworker or a friend from high school, but when I got closer, their face would shift, features rearranging just enough to make them strangers again. I stopped waving at anyone. At some point, I started keeping a notebook. Not for answers. I wasn't deluded enough to think I'd figure this out, but just to keep track. I'd jot down the date, the change, and anything else I noticed. Mug disappeared. I wrote on the first page. Later entries became longer. Chair at my desk swapped from gray to blue, one said. Neighbor's dog is now a different breed entirely. Was a golden retriever, now a pug. I filled pages with these notes, watching as the familiar world around me unraveled piece by piece. The strange thing was, it didn't feel scary anymore. It felt inevitable. One day, I decided to test it. I placed a sticky note on my bathroom mirror, bright pink with a single word, "Here." I figured if the note stayed, maybe it was proof that something was still solid. But when I returned, the sticky note wasn't gone. It had moved. Now it was on the mirror in my hallway, still bright pink, still saying "Here," as if mocking me. I tried it again the next day, and again the note relocated, this time to the fridge. I stopped bothering after a week. What was the point? The final shift came quietly. I was walking home from the grocery store, carrying a bag that felt suspiciously light. I'd bought milk, bread, and eggs, but when I opened it, the milk was gone. In its place was a can of peaches. I didn't even like peaches. As I reached my apartment building, I noticed a man sitting on the steps. He wore a green hoodie, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. "You're not supposed to notice," he said. His voice was calm, almost apologetic. Before I could respond, he stood and walked away, disappearing around the corner. That night, I sat on my couch, holding the can of peaches, and stared at my notebook. Page after page of meticulous notes stared back at me. None of it mattered. The glitches weren't mistakes to be fixed. They were the new reality. My reflection in the mirror flickered for just a moment, smiling wider than I was. I blinked, and it was gone. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like an observer. Detached. Peripheral. I flipped to a blank page in my notebook, wrote down the date, and stared at the line for a long time before adding the words, "I think I'm part of it now." It began, if you could call it a beginning, with a sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like rain against a window, except the sky was clear, and the sound wasn't coming from outside. I first noticed it while brushing my teeth. My apartment was quiet except for the running water, but underneath that was the faint, repetitive beat, somewhere in the walls. I paused, toothbrush in hand, trying to place it. Pipes? Mice? I lived in a building old enough to make noises, but this one felt out of place, like it wasn't supposed to be there. By the time I finished brushing, the tapping had stopped. I forgot about it entirely until later that night, when I heard it again while scrolling on my phone in bed. This time, it was louder, closer, and it came in perfect sets of 3. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall right behind my bed. Annoyed but unalarmed, I knocked back. A single, irritated thump with my fist. The sound stopped, but only for a moment. Then it resumed, faster now, almost frantic. Tap, 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 tap. I turned on the light, heart thudding harder than I cared to admit, and pressed my ear to the wall. There was nothing there, just drywall, cool and still. When I knocked again, the tapping stopped for good. The next morning, I mentioned the sound to my landlord, Mr. Crane, as I passed him in the lobby. He was a wiry old man who always smelled faintly of mothballs and coffee. "Probably the pipes," he said, without much interest. "This building's full of quirks." Quirks felt like an understatement as the days wore on. The tapping returned every night, always in the same pattern, and always stopping the moment I turned on the light. Then it spread to other places. The closet, the bathroom, even the ceiling above my couch. Each time, it felt as though it was coming from somewhere just out of reach, behind or beyond, but never close enough to touch. It wasn't just the tapping either. One morning, I woke up to find my kitchen chairs turned upside down on the table. I lived alone and didn't drink, so the sight hit me like a punch to the stomach. I set the chairs back, convincing myself I'd done it in my sleep, though I'd never sleepwalked before. Another time, I found my TV remote inside the freezer. It was cold to the touch, frosting over as if it had been there for hours. The strangest part was that my neighbors didn't seem to notice anything unusual. I asked the woman next door, a nurse who worked nights, if she'd heard the tapping. She tilted her head, confused, and said her apartment had been perfectly quiet. Jake from 3B said he'd been hearing noises, too, but when I pressed him for details, his answers grew vague. "It's just an old building," he said finally, and walked away before I could say more. After a week, the tapping changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was a melody, a faint, haunting tune played in a series of rapid knocks that set my teeth on edge. Sometimes it was almost recognizable, like a song I'd heard long ago and forgotten. Other times, it dissolved into a chaotic clatter, as if whatever was making the noise had lost control. No one else claimed to hear it. My landlord dismissed me with a wave, muttering about imagination getting the better of me. And then the faces started appearing. It was subtle at first. Smudges on my bathroom mirror that vaguely resembled eyes and a mouth, condensation patterns on the window that seemed too deliberate to be random. The first time I saw one clearly, I was stepping out of the shower. The mirror was fogged over, except for a perfect oval where a face had pressed against it, leaving an imprint too precise, too detailed to dismiss as coincidence. Its eyes were wide, almost cartoonishly so, and its mouth was open as if caught mid-scream. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before wiping the mirror with a towel. When I looked again, it was gone. After that, the faces became bolder. I'd catch glimpses of them in reflective surfaces. The dark screen of my TV, the polished handle of a kitchen drawer, even the glossy surface of my coffee table. Always the same face, wide-eyed, gaping-mouthed, and always gone the second I blinked. By now, I was sleeping with the lights on, though it did little to help. The tapping never stopped, and the faces grew more persistent. Once, I woke up to find a faint outline of one on the wall above my bed, drawn in what looked like dust or ash. I wiped it away with trembling hands and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. One evening, desperate for answers, I decided to record the sounds. I set up my phone on the nightstand and let it run while I pretended to sleep. The tapping started right on schedule, the melody more erratic than ever. I lay there, heart pounding, until it finally stopped. When I checked the recording, I froze. It wasn't just tapping. There was breathing, slow, raspy, and human. And beneath that, faint but unmistakable, a voice whispering my name over and over. Anna, Anna, Anna. I replayed the recording until the sound blurred into meaningless noise. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag, planning to crash with a friend for a while, but as I reached for the door, I felt it. A presence, heavy and cold, standing right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My shadow stretched out on the wall in front of me, but it wasn't alone. Another shadow stood next to it, tall, thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. When I finally turned, the apartment was empty. I left anyway, abandoning most of my belongings. My friend let me stay at her place, but the relief was short-lived. The tapping followed me, faint at first, like a distant echo, but growing louder every night. The faces appeared in her mirrors, her windows, her glossy coffee table. She started noticing them, too, though she wouldn't admit it outright. She just stopped looking me in the eye, stopped sitting in the same room as me. Last night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her mouth opened, and a sound like static poured out. I don't think it was her anymore. I'm writing this from my car, parked in a lot miles from anywhere. The tapping is coming from the trunk now, rhythmic and deliberate. I won't open it. I can't. But it doesn't matter. I can still hear my name. It wasn't obvious at first. The changes crept in subtly, like the tickle of static before a storm. I was cleaning my apartment, something I rarely had the energy for, and noticed my bookcase seemed off. The books were all there, sure, lined up neatly as they always were. But a dog-eared paperback that I distinctly remembered setting on the coffee table the day before was now wedged between two hardcovers. I didn't move it. I was certain, but who else could have? I lived alone, had no pets, and rarely entertained guests. I pulled the book out, flipped through its pages, and placed it back on the table, deliberately leaving it askew. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe I'd simply forgotten moving it. The next morning, it was back in the bookcase. It was wedged in the same spot, as if it had never been touched. My stomach did a little flip. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself that I must be sleepwalking or misremembering again. But a deeper part of me, an ancient instinct I couldn't name, began to whisper that something wasn't right. The following days unfolded like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. I'd return home from errands to find small, almost imperceptible shifts. A chair angled slightly differently than how I'd left it. A pen I swore I'd placed on the desk now lying in a drawer. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. These weren't the grand, dramatic glitches of science fiction. They were smaller, quieter, like ripples on the surface of a still lake. One evening, I came home to find my clock blinking 12 o'clock, as if there had been a power outage. That wouldn't have been unusual. My building wasn't exactly known for its reliable electricity, but my phone, my microwave, even my laptop were all perfectly in sync. I reset the clock and tried to ignore the crawling unease that had taken up residence in my chest. The next day, it happened again. This time, the clock wasn't just blinking. It was showing a time that made no sense. 74:83. I stared at it, the nonsensical digits casting a strange glow over my kitchen, until finally, the numbers resolved themselves into something familiar. But that brief flicker of the impossible stuck with me. By the end of the week, reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. I walked to the grocery store, only to see my neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, emerging from his car at the exact same moment, 3 times in a row. Each time, he wore the same faded plaid jacket, carried the same reusable shopping bag, and gave me the same polite nod. By the third loop, I stopped walking and stood there, my mouth dry, as he performed the routine once more. This time, I waved at him, something I hadn't done before. He didn't react, just nodded and walked inside, the doorbell chiming as it always did. I wanted to confront someone, anyone, but how do you explain a world that seems to be skipping like a scratched record? People would think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just me. The world was wrong, though it carried on with the confidence of a seasoned liar. Then came the night I woke to a sound I couldn't place. A faint, metallic hum, like a machine spinning up in a faraway room. I sat up in bed, the hair on my arms standing on end. The room was bathed in its usual darkness, but something felt different. The air itself seemed thicker, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. I reached for my phone, but the screen stayed blank no matter how many times I pressed the button. The clock on my nightstand read midnight, the colon blinking slowly, insistently. The hum grew louder, and then the walls shimmered. Not like a mirage, not like heat waves on asphalt. They rippled, as though reality itself was made of water and someone had just tossed a pebble into the surface. My breath caught in my throat. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing the wall. It felt solid, but as I pulled my hand back, I saw faint trails of light tracing where my fingertips had been, like the afterimage of a sparkler. I stumbled into the living room, half expecting to find everything rearranged, or worse, melting. Instead, the room was eerily still, except for the clock. That damn clock was blinking again, this time faster, the numbers scrolling through a sequence too rapid to read. I froze as the hum reached a crescendo and then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. I stood there, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, waiting for the world to right itself. But it didn't. Something had shifted. The room looked exactly as it had moments before, but it felt different, as though someone had copied it and forgotten a few invisible details. The next morning, I tried to carry on as usual, though my hands trembled as I brushed my teeth. The sense of repetition was gone, replaced by something even more unsettling, the absence of time. My phone no longer displayed the date, only a string of nonsensical symbols that shifted whenever I tried to focus on them. The sunlight streaming through my window didn't feel like morning light. It had the sharp, white quality of a photograph, frozen in an endless noon. That evening, I ventured outside, desperate to feel normal again. But the streets were eerily empty. The faint smell of ozone hung in the air, and I swore the shadows of the buildings were stretching the wrong way. I wandered aimlessly until I found myself at the park, where I often came to clear my head. Except the park wasn't quite right. The trees stood too still, their leaves unmoving even in the light breeze. A single bird circled the sky, tracing the same lazy loop over and over. I sat on a bench, staring at the impossible serenity, and let my thoughts spiral. What if this wasn't my world? What if I was a copy, a placeholder in some larger program? The idea should have terrified me, but instead, it brought a strange kind of clarity. If the world wasn't real, then the rules I'd always followed didn't matter. I could sit here forever, watching the bird repeat its path, and nothing would change. Or I could test the boundaries. I reached down, picked up a stone, and hurled it at the sky. It arced high, then froze midair. For a moment, it hung there, suspended like a glitching frame in a video, before falling straight down with a thud. The bird continued its loop, oblivious. As I stood, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't afraid. Whatever this was, glitch, dream, or simulation, it wasn't mine to control. But I wasn't just a victim either. Maybe the system was watching me, but I could watch it back. And for now, that would have to be enough. I moved into the apartment on a whim, tired of my old place and its perpetually broken heat. The complex was modest, the kind of building with chipped paint and aging carpets in the hallways, but it had charm. It also came with neighbors, something I hadn't had in years, and that was both exciting and mildly unsettling. I'm more of a keep-to-myself kind of person, and I worried about being drawn into potluck dinners or, worse, passive-aggressive notes about noise levels. For the first week, though, it was blissfully quiet. I saw people in passing, nods and polite smiles exchanged in the lobby, and that was enough. It wasn't until the second week that I met him. I was fumbling with my keys one evening, my hands full of groceries, when I heard footsteps behind me. A man's voice spoke up, cheerful and warm. "Need a hand?" I turned to see a guy, probably mid-30s, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had the kind of face that put you at ease, with a wide smile and slightly messy hair that looked unintentional. I laughed, a little embarrassed by my struggle, and said, "Sure, thanks." He grabbed the bags I'd been balancing against my hip and followed me inside. "I'm Jonah," he said, setting the groceries on the counter once we reached my apartment. "I live across the hall. Thought I'd introduce myself." I thanked him, a little unsure how to respond to his friendliness. He didn't seem overbearing, though, just neighborly. I learned he was new to the building, too, which explained his eagerness to make connections. We chatted for a few minutes about the area and our mutual frustration with the elevator that kept breaking down. Then, he excused himself and left me to unpack. Nice guy, I thought. Friendly, but not too pushy. It was a relief, honestly. Over the next few weeks, I'd run into Jonah more frequently. At first, it was always coincidental. In the lobby, by the mailboxes, or on my way to the laundry room. He'd wave, make a joke about something mundane, and move along. Then, the coincidences started to feel less coincidental. I'd step out of my apartment, and he'd just happen to be leaving his too. Or I'd head to the parking lot, and he'd be there, casually leaning against his car as though he'd been waiting. Still, he never crossed a line. He was charming, even thoughtful. One morning, he knocked on my door with a cup of coffee, saying, "Figured you could use one." It's Monday, after all. I didn't even drink coffee, but I accepted it to be polite. The first moment of unease came a few days later. I'd been walking home from work when I realized Jonah was behind me, a few steps back. I hadn't seen him leave the building when I did that morning, and I certainly hadn't mentioned my work schedule. "Hey," he called when I turned around. "Fancy seeing you here." I forced a smile, trying not to show my surprise. "Yeah, small world." He caught up and fell into step beside me. I didn't realize we worked so close to each other. I just grabbed lunch around the corner. It wasn't impossible, but something about it felt off. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. He couldn't have followed me. Why would he? The encounters continued, each one slightly more unnerving than the last. Jonah would make comments that seemed innocent at first, but left me uneasy once I replayed them in my head later. Things like, "You're always so put together, but you don't have a messy side, huh?" Or, "Must be nice having your own place. No one to bother you, right?" There was a tone to his words, something just shy of teasing but not quite admiring either. I started avoiding him when I could, taking the stairs instead of the elevator and waiting an extra few minutes in my car if I saw him in the parking lot. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. It was late, and I live on the third floor, so it struck me as odd. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, followed by a soft, scraping noise, like someone brushing against the door. I crept to the peephole, half expecting to see nothing. But there he was, Jonah, standing there with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't knocking or trying to get in. He was just standing there, staring at my door. I didn't breathe until he finally turned and walked back to his own apartment. The next day, I convinced myself I must have imagined it. Maybe he'd lost something and was checking the hall. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been listening, waiting for something. A week later, I came home to find a small package outside my door. It wasn't unusual. Online orders came all the time. But this one had no label. I opened it cautiously, and inside was a small, carved wooden bird. No note, No explanation. It was beautiful but strange, and I couldn't think of anyone who would have sent it. Later that evening, Jonah knocked. When I opened the door, he grinned. "Did you like it?" "Like what?" "The bird. I made it for you. Thought it might cheer you up. You've seemed a little stressed lately." My stomach sank. "Oh wow, thanks. That was thoughtful." I was trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked slightly. How had he noticed I was stressed? I hadn't even seen him in days. That night, I locked every window and door, double-checking each one. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint creaks and noises I was sure were just my imagination. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Are you okay? You seemed scared earlier. I didn't mean to upset you." My hands shook as I stared at the screen. It had to be him. I didn't respond, and the next day, I went straight to the building manager. I tried to explain what was happening without sounding dramatic, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Has he actually done anything threatening?" he asked. I couldn't say he had. Jonah hadn't broken in, hadn't made explicit threats, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, waiting for an opportunity. The manager promised to keep an eye out, but I left the office feeling worse than before. That evening, I stayed late at work, dreading going home. When I finally did, the hallway was empty, eerily quiet. As I unlocked my door, I felt eyes on me. Turning quickly, I saw Jonah standing at the end of the hall. He didn't say anything, just watched as I stepped inside and shut the door. I haven't seen him in 2 days. I should feel relieved, but instead, I feel trapped, like the quiet is just a prelude to something worse. Was he just an overly friendly neighbor, or was I right to be afraid? I keep telling myself it's all in my head, but I can't shake the thought that he's still out there, waiting. When I rented the place on Ashwood Lane, I didn't expect luxury. The price was too good, the landlord too quick to hand me the keys. Still, it wasn't bad. A mid-century house with a patchy lawn and a porch that creaked like an old rocking chair. It was quiet, a little too quiet, but that was exactly what I thought I needed after the chaos of downtown living. I moved in on a Thursday and spent the day unpacking, settling into the routine of a place that felt stubbornly unfamiliar. It was small things at first, things I brushed off as quirks of a house that had seen better decades. The light switch in the kitchen only worked if I jiggled it just right. The water in the bathroom sink took an eternity to warm. At night, there was a faint humming, like an old refrigerator struggling to stay alive, but no amount of searching uncovered its source. I chalked it up to old pipes and bad wiring. Nothing unusual. That changed on the third night. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed it. The house had gone utterly still. No hum, no distant creaks, no ambient sounds at all. Just a suffocating quiet that made me acutely aware of my own breathing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the screen in front of me, but then the air shifted. It wasn't a breeze. There were no open windows, but the temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath. And then, I heard it. Not footsteps, not voices, but a low, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like fingernails dragged slowly across wood. It came from the hallway. I stared toward the darkness, my heart thudding hard enough to echo in my ears. The scraping continued, rhythmic, deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight app on my phone and stepped into the hall. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment the light hit the floorboards. I let out a shaky laugh, muttering to myself about how easily I scared, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't, but the silence wasn't comforting. It pressed in on me, heavy and stifling, until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found the scratches. Thin, jagged lines gouged into the floor near the hall closet. They hadn't been there when I moved in. I crouched down, running my fingers over them, and noticed something else. The door to the closet was ajar. Not much, just a crack, but I was sure I'd left it closed. Inside, there was nothing, just an empty rod for hanging clothes and a dusty floor. But as I crouched there, staring into the shadows, I felt an overwhelming urge to shut the door and never open it again. It was absurd, irrational. There was nothing there. I forced myself to stay a moment longer, to prove that fear hadn't gotten the better of me, before closing the door and stepping back. Over the next few days, the scratches multiplied. They appeared not just in the hallway but on the walls, the doors, even the ceiling. I tried sanding one down, but the next morning, it was back, deeper and angrier than before. I stopped trying after that. Instead, I focused on finding answers. I called the landlord, who swore the house had no issues, no history worth mentioning. "It's an old place," he said. "Sometimes they feel alive, don't they? Like they've soaked up all the lives that came before." I hung up on him, frustrated and more unnerved than before. The scratching grew worse. I started hearing it during the day, even when I was in the room it seemed to come from. But it wasn't just the scratching anymore. At night, I'd wake up to a strange pressure at the foot of my bed, as though something was sitting there, watching. I couldn't see anything, but the weight was unmistakable. I decided to set up a camera, just one, trained on the hallway where the scratches had started. That night, I left the lights on and forced myself to sleep. The scratching came again, louder than ever, but I stayed in bed, gripping the sheets and waiting for it to stop. The next morning, I checked the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The hallway remained empty, the camera silent. But around 3:14 a.m., the screen flickered, distorting for a fraction of a second. When the image returned, the scratches on the floor were deeper. The door to the closet swung open, slowly and deliberately, but there was no one there. And then something moved. Not a person, not an animal, but a shadow. It seeped out of the closet like smoke, curling and twisting along the floor before slithering up the wall. For a moment, it paused, forming the vague outline of something humanoid, before dissolving into the darkness. I stopped watching. I left that day, grabbing a bag of essentials and telling myself I'd come back for the rest when I'd figured out what to do. But I didn't go back. Not after what happened that night. I was staying at a motel on the edge of town, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, when I woke to the sound of scratching. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming from the door to my room. Slowly, I got up and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the scratching continued. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my chest, and that's when I noticed it. The mirror above the motel dresser. Something was standing behind me, tall, featureless, and impossibly dark. I turned, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I checked out at sunrise and drove without a destination, just trying to put distance between myself and whatever I'd brought with me. Because that's what I realized, somewhere on the endless stretch of highway. It wasn't the house. It was never the house. It was the thing that had been in the house, waiting, and now it was with me. I don't know where to go. I don't know if I'll ever be far enough. But sometimes, when it's quiet, I still hear it. Scratching. When I moved into 6B, it wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Just a new start in a new city, the kind of uninspired but practical decision you make when you're running out of options. The building was old, with a tired charm that whispered history, but didn't shout haunted, which was enough for me. The walls had that faded beige hue that no one chooses on purpose, and the faint smell of lemons from what I assumed was an overzealous cleaning effort clung to the air. It was normal, almost aggressively so. I liked that about it. The first week felt like acclimating to a pair of stiff shoes. The radiator clanged with a noise somewhere between a cough and a groan, and the upstairs neighbors walked with a stomp that made me wonder if they had bricks for feet. But it was mine. A little box I could lock up at the end of the day and pretend that nothing outside mattered. I settled in slowly, adding the usual touches: bookshelves, a new rug, and a couple of thrift store paintings. I was content. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed the hallway. It shouldn't have caught my attention. It was just a standard hallway, bland and forgettable, with chipped baseboards and cheap carpeting that squeaked faintly underfoot. But it felt off. It was the kind of feeling you get when someone's staring at you across a crowded room. Not obvious, but sharp enough to itch at the back of your brain. The hallway was the same as it had been the day I moved in, yet somehow it felt different. The first time I noticed the change, it was small. The door to the utility closet at the far end had moved a little closer to my own. Not much, maybe just a few inches, but enough for me to blink and wonder if I was misremembering. I chalked it up to being tired from work and ignored it. By the next evening, the utility closet wasn't just closer. It was directly across from my door. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. The numbers 6C on its frame were the same as always, the dull brass tarnished at the edges. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but a thin, low hum that seemed to emanate from inside stopped me cold. The sound was faint, like static bleeding through a weak radio signal. I told myself it was probably a boiler or some other ancient piece of equipment humming along behind the door, and went inside my apartment. After that, things escalated. The hallway wasn't just changing subtly, it was reshaping itself in ways that defied logic. One morning, it stretched impossibly long, the other doors receding into the distance like they were being swallowed by a tunnel. The next evening, it was shorter than I'd ever seen it, barely 3 doors long, with mine dead center. I didn't have neighbors anymore, not in any way that made sense. Each time I opened my door, the layout was different, as if the building was trying on new arrangements to see which one fit best. I started keeping notes. I sketched maps of the hallway after every trip out, documenting which doors were where and how far they were from mine. But the patterns didn't hold. No matter how carefully I measured or what landmarks I used, the next time I stepped outside, the hallway was something entirely new. One morning, I swear I could see sunlight streaming in from a window at the far end. A window that should have overlooked the parking lot. When I walked toward it, the light flickered like a dying bulb and disappeared, leaving only the faint, sterile glow of the overhead fluorescence. The changes weren't limited to the hallway. My apartment began to turn on me in subtle, insidious ways. My furniture would rearrange itself when I wasn't looking. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them hours later in the freezer. My bathroom mirror started reflecting things that weren't in the room. An empty rocking chair swaying gently in a non-existent corner, or the edge of a picture frame that didn't match any I owned. Once, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing behind me in the mirror. It wasn't clear, more like a smudge of shadow shaped vaguely like a person. When I turned around, nothing was there. The whispers started after the first month. Soft at first, almost gentle, like someone speaking through a pillow. I couldn't make out the words, just the cadence, the rise and fall of voices that sounded too close to be coming from the other apartments. They were in my vents, in my walls, in my head. They followed me into sleep, their rhythm lulling me into a dreamless haze that left me more exhausted each morning. One night, I woke to the sound of my name. It wasn't loud, just a single word, spoken with a quiet insistence that drilled into my brain like a dentist's pick. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The bedroom door was ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it. Beyond it, the hallway stretched impossibly far again, its edges shrouded in darkness. At the very end, I saw movement, a flicker of pale, angular limbs retreating into the shadows. I stopped sleeping after that. I stopped leaving the apartment unless it was absolutely necessary. I taped the windows shut, stacked furniture in front of the doors, anything to feel secure. But the changes didn't stop. My walls began to breathe, faintly at first, the plaster bowing inward as if the apartment were alive and exhaling. My bookshelves emptied themselves overnight, their contents piling in the center of the living room. A new door appeared in my bedroom wall, one I didn't dare open. And then, one morning, the hallway was gone. When I opened my door, there was nothing but a yawning black void where the hallway should have been. The air beyond was thick and cloying, like walking into a room filled with smoke. The whispers were louder there, almost jubilant, but still incomprehensible. I slammed the door shut and locked it, though deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. Now, I can hear something moving behind the new door in my bedroom. It scratches and shuffles, as if testing the threshold. I've shoved my dresser against it, but the wood trembles every time the thing behind it presses closer. The whispers have turned to laughter, low, cruel, and bubbling with something I can't name. The utility closet door is back, right outside my apartment now. It's open, just a crack, and the static hum from inside is louder than ever. It's almost inviting. I'm running out of options. I don't think I'm supposed to leave. I think I'm supposed to go in, The first time I met the man in the blue coat, it was an accident. Or at least, I thought it was. I was in a rush to catch the late bus, the cold night air biting through my jacket, when I collided with him at the corner near my building. He smelled faintly of old leather and rain, and his gloved hand steadied me before I fell. "Apologies," he said, his voice smooth but distant. His face, shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat, didn't strike me as memorable. I mumbled something about it being my fault, and he nodded before walking on. I didn't think of him again until the following week, when I noticed him standing across the street from my window. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I was curled up on the couch with a book. I glanced up, and there he was, motionless, facing my building. It wasn't menacing, just odd. He didn't seem to notice me watching, and after a while, he turned and walked away. I convinced myself it was a coincidence. People waited on that corner all the time for cabs or friends. The second time was harder to dismiss. It was late at night, and I'd stopped by the convenience store to grab a snack. As I browsed the candy aisle, I felt a peculiar heaviness in the air, like the faint pressure of an unseen hand on my shoulder. I turned to see the man in the blue coat at the end of the aisle, staring. His face was still obscured by that hat, but something in his posture felt purposeful, deliberate. My chest tightened, and I quickly moved to the register. By the time I left the store, he was gone. I began noticing him more often after that. He'd appear in strange, fleeting ways, a shadow on the opposite platform as my train pulled out of the station, a figure half hidden in the crowd at a farmer's market, always just far enough away to make me doubt myself, and always wearing that same blue coat. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Cities are full of strangers. But the strange coincidences piled up. My mail began arriving at odd times, even though I hadn't changed my schedule. A crack appeared in my bedroom window that I didn't remember being there before. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I caught movement in the mirror and turned just in time to see a figure slipping past my living room window. My apartment was on the second floor. When I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older woman who always smelled faintly of lavender, she gave me a tight-lipped smile. "If you see him, don't invite him in," she said abruptly. I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She looked at me for a long moment, as if deciding whether I was worth the explanation. "The man in the blue coat," she said finally. "He's not from here." That night, I bolted my windows and drew the curtains. I couldn't shake her words. Not from here. What did that mean? And why hadn't I ever really seen his face? Even in my memory, his features felt smeared, like an unfinished painting. I dreamed of him that night, standing in my living room, silent, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. When I woke, my curtains were open, though I was certain I had closed them before bed. My heart hammered as I approached the window, half expecting to see him below. But the street was empty. The next time he appeared, I decided to confront him. I was walking home late, the kind of night where the streets feel too quiet, the shadows too deep. There he was, standing at the corner near my building, just as he had the night we first collided. Something in me snapped. I marched toward him, my fear overtaken by anger. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling despite my resolve. He didn't move. His head tilted slightly, as though considering me. Up close, his presence was overwhelming, like the air had thickened around him. "You asked," he said softly, "and now you've opened the door." I blinked, confused. Asked what? Opened what door? He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. It was mine. I stumbled back, breathless. The resemblance wasn't exact. His features were sharper, his eyes too dark, but it was close enough to leave me reeling. What are you?" I managed to stammer. He smiled, thin and humorless. "A shadow," he said, as though it was obvious. "You've been carrying me for years, whether you knew it or not." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. His words wrapped around me, cold and suffocating. "We're bound, you and I," he continued. "Every time you doubted yourself, every decision you regretted, every path you left untaken, you gave me shape. And now, here I am." I shook my head, trying to make sense of his words. That's insane, I whispered. Is it? He asked, stepping closer still. You've seen me before, haven't you? In dreams. In fleeting moments you couldn't explain. You've always known I was there. I couldn't deny it. Memories surfaced, familiar but forgotten. That strange figure in the crowd when I was 7. The shadow that didn't match any light when I was 15. A face that had lingered at the edges of my mind, just out of focus. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice breaking. To finish what we started, he said simply. And then he reached out, his gloved hand brushing my shoulder. The world around me seemed to fold inward. The streetlights dimmed, and the air grew colder than I thought possible. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, and in that moment, I understood what he meant. He wasn't here to harm me. He was here to become me. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us both was my own reflection in his eyes, staring back with a mix of terror and something far worse, recognition. It started with a knock. 3 sharp raps on the door of my apartment at exactly 3:33 a.m. I woke up immediately, heart pounding in that irrational way you get when you're startled awake. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I live alone. For a second, I thought it was a dream, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Slow and deliberate. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of an old building with no security cameras and a busted intercom system. Nobody can get in without a key unless someone lets them in. I grabbed my phone and looked at the screen. 3:33 a.m. Exactly. My throat felt tight, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Peeking through the peephole, I was greeted with darkness. Not just dim light or shadows, but complete blackness, like someone had covered the peephole with tape. My stomach dropped. Who's there? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I waited, my fingers tightening around the doorframe. If this is a prank, it's not funny. Still nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever before I finally backed away from the door. I sat on the couch, trying to convince myself it was just some drunk neighbor messing around. After about 20 minutes, I hadn't heard anything else, so I went back to bed, though I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The next morning, I noticed something strange on the door. Just below the peephole, there was a smear of something dark and oily, like a handprint. I reached out to touch it but stopped when I realized it reeked, like burnt hair and something metallic. I scrubbed it off with a disinfectant wipe, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. It wasn't until later that day when I talked to my downstairs neighbor, Carla, that I started feeling genuinely scared. Did you hear someone knocking last night? I asked her casually, leaning against the doorframe of her apartment. Carla's face went pale. You too, she said. She told me she'd heard knocking at her door around the same time, but when she checked, no one was there. It freaked me out, she admitted, her voice low. I thought maybe it was just kids, but I don't know. It didn't feel right. Over the next few nights, things got worse. Every night at 3:33 a.m., the knocking would start. It moved from my door to Carla's, and even to the empty unit at the end of the hall. It always came in threes. Knock, 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 and stopped if I tried to look outside. One night, I stayed up with all the lights on, determined to catch whoever was doing it. When the knock started, I ripped open the door without even checking the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. There was a faint smell, something like the oily handprint from before, but stronger. I stood there, heart hammering, until I heard Carla's voice behind me. Did you see them? She asked. Her eyes were wide, and her face was pale. See who? I asked, confused. Carla hesitated, then pointed to the window at the end of the hallway. They're always there, she whispered. I turned to look, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the reflection of the glass. Something tall and thin, just outside the edge of the light. But when I blinked, it was gone. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. By the 5th night, I was a wreck. Every knock sent me spiraling into panic, but it wasn't until I woke up to find my front door unlocked that I knew I had to do something. I'm obsessive about locking my door. It's the first thing I do when I come home. The chain was still latched, but the deadbolt was undone. I called the building manager, who checked the security logs and confirmed what I already knew. No one had entered the building that night. Desperate, I set up a cheap motion-activated camera outside my door. That night, when the knocks came, I didn't answer. I just sat on my couch, clutching my phone and waiting for the alert from the camera. Sure enough, the notification came through at exactly 3:33 a.m. I opened the app, expecting to see a neighbor or some prankster in the hallway. Instead, the screen was pitch black, just like the peephole had been. Then the blackness moved. It shifted, almost like a shadow, sliding toward the camera. I could hear faint static, like the sound of wind, but no footsteps, no breathing, nothing that sounded human. The screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw something. A face, pale and featureless, with empty, black eyes staring straight into the lens. The camera cut out after that. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even bring myself to open the door the next morning. Carla texted me around noon, saying she was leaving to stay with her sister. "I can't stay here," she wrote. "It's not safe." I didn't blame her, but I couldn't just leave. I didn't have anywhere else to go. That night, the knocking didn't come at 3:33 a.m. I thought maybe it was over, but then I heard it. 3 knocks, this time from inside my closet. I froze. My closet door was barely 3 feet away, and I could see the doorknob turning slowly as if someone, or something, was testing it. I grabbed the knife from under my pillow and backed into the corner of the room, my eyes fixed on the closet. The door creaked open, but nothing came out. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel it. Something watching me, waiting. The smell hit me again, that awful mix of burnt hair and metal, stronger than ever. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the knife, before the door finally closed on its own. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I moved out 3 days later, breaking my lease and leaving most of my stuff behind. I couldn't risk taking anything with me. I didn't want whatever it was following me. It's been 6 months, and I haven't heard the knocking since. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the faint smell of burnt hair and metal. And every time, I check my closet. The first time I saw her, I thought she was a shadow. Not in a poetic sense, but literally, a shadow cast by something I couldn't see. I was walking home from my part-time job at the diner, just after midnight. My backpack slung over one shoulder and my earbuds pumping out some pop song I barely remember now. The streetlights buzzed faintly above me, flickering like they always did. Our neighborhood wasn't sketchy, but it wasn't exactly comforting either. A mix of old, sagging houses and overgrown lots that the city seemed to have forgotten about decades ago. I cut through the park, like always. It saved me 5 minutes and avoided the creepy guy on the corner who always muttered to himself. The park was quiet, empty. Just the faint smell of damp grass and the sound of crickets chirping somewhere in the shadows. That's when I saw her, or it, standing under one of the lamps near the playground. At first glance, it looked like a person, but something was off. Too thin, too tall, like someone had taken a human silhouette and stretched it out just a little too far. I slowed down, pulling out one earbud. I couldn't see her face. The light above flickered, and her figure seemed to flicker with it, like she wasn't really there. Or like my eyes couldn't quite decide if they were seeing her at all. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe a tree branch casting a shadow. Maybe my imagination. I walked faster, not running. Running felt like an admission of fear, but fast enough that my heart started pounding harder than it should have. When I glanced back, she was gone. The lamp still buzzed faintly above the empty playground, and I could hear the swing creaking softly, though there was no wind to push it. I didn't stop to investigate. That should have been the end of it. Weird, but ultimately explainable. A trick of the light. Maybe I'd been tired. But the next night, she was there again, standing in the exact same spot. This time, I didn't hesitate. I crossed the street before I reached the park and took the long way home. I didn't look back. For a few days, I thought I was fine. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I was scared of a shadow? But things started happening. Small things at first. I'd come home and find my bedroom window open, even though I was sure I'd closed it. The next morning, my alarm clock was on the floor, smashed to pieces, even though I hadn't touched it. And then there were the whispers. They started at night, just as I was about to fall asleep. Faint, indistinct murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought it was the TV in the living room, but when I went to check, the TV was off. My parents were asleep. The house was silent, except for the whispers that seemed to be coming from inside my own room. I began sleeping with the lights on. It didn't help. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They didn't sound human. There was something jagged about them, like they were spoken through clenched teeth or broken glass. I started keeping my phone's flashlight on, sweeping it around the room every time I woke up. Once, for a split second, I thought I saw her, just a shape, crouched in the corner near my closet. When I blinked, she was gone. But the closet door was open, though I knew I'd closed it before bed. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my blanket and went asleep on the couch in the living room. I figured if there was something in my room, it wouldn't follow me there. I stayed up as long as I could, watching old reruns on TV until my eyelids grew heavy. When I finally dozed off, it wasn't for long. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table. Groggy, I reached for it, expecting some random spam text. Instead, it was a notification from my camera app, the one I hadn't opened in weeks. It had taken a photo. My hand shook as I opened the app, my pulse thundering in my ears. The picture showed my bedroom. Not the living room where I was now, but my bedroom. The lamp on the nightstand cast a dim glow, and the closet door was wide open. In the doorway stood a figure, blacker than black, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. The photo timestamp said 2:47 a.m. I checked the time on my phone. It was 2:48 a.m. My heart nearly stopped when I heard it. The creak of the hallway floorboards. The sound of someone, or something, walking toward the living room. I didn't look. I couldn't. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blanket over my head like a child, praying to anyone who would listen that whatever it was would go away. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the blanket shifted, ever so slightly, as if someone had brushed against it. I held my breath, tears streaming down my face. When I finally gathered the courage to peek out, the room was empty. But my phone was gone. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My mom thought I was stressed. My dad suggested laying off horror movies. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. A week later, the phone turned up in the park, under the same lamp where I'd first seen her. It was dead, but when I plugged it in, there were dozens of photos in the gallery. All of them showed my house, taken from outside the windows, each one closer than the last. The final photo wasn't of my house at all. It was of me, sleeping on the couch, the blanket pulled up to my chin. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was her shadow, stretching impossibly long across the floor. I moved out as soon as I could, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. I had just wrapped up a late shift at the bookstore where I worked, and I was eager to get home, throw on some sweatpants, and unwind with my cat. The weather was turning colder, and the streets were eerily quiet as I stepped out into the crisp night air. My car was parked a couple of blocks away, and while I usually felt safe in this part of town, something about the stillness of the evening set me on edge. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination and started walking. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting an anemic yellow glow on the cracked sidewalk. I noticed that a few of the lights were out, leaving patches of complete darkness between the pools of light. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing faintly off the buildings. About halfway to my car, I heard it, a second set of footsteps, faint but deliberate, falling into rhythm with mine. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe the sound was bouncing off the alleyways, creating an auditory illusion. I slowed my pace slightly, and the other footsteps slowed too. My heart started to race. I glanced over my shoulder casually, not wanting to seem paranoid, and saw a figure about 20 yards behind me. They were walking with their hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark coat, their head down, the brim of a baseball cap obscuring their face. It could have been anyone. Plenty of people walk this route, especially this time of night. Still, something about the way they moved, calculated, almost predatory, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned back around and picked up my pace, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the first patch of darkness, I felt a deep instinctual fear, like stepping into a predator's den. My mind raced with every horror story I'd ever heard, every unsolved mystery I'd read about late at night. I told myself to stay calm, to not show fear, but my hands were trembling. The footsteps behind me were getting louder. Whoever it was, they were closing the distance between us. I considered running, but my car was still at least a block away. If I took off, I'd be broadcasting my fear, and I didn't know if I could outrun them. Instead, I reached into my bag and fumbled for my keys, letting them dangle between my fingers like a makeshift weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I could feel my breath quickening, and I tried to steady it, to keep my movements casual, like I hadn't noticed anything was wrong. As I approached the next patch of light, I dared another glance behind me. The figure was closer now, no more than 10 yards away, and I could see that they were tall, with a broad frame that made them seem even more imposing. Their head was still down, but I could feel their focus on me, like a weight pressing on my back. I swallowed hard and kept walking, my legs trembling so badly I was afraid I'd stumble. When I finally saw my car, I nearly cried with relief. I quickened my pace, my keys clutched so tightly in my hand that they were digging into my palm. The sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, faster. I didn't dare look back again. I reached my car and hit the unlock button on my key fob, the loud chirp of the locks disengaging echoing through the empty street. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut, locking it manually for good measure. That's when I made my biggest mistake. Instead of starting the car immediately, I looked up. The figure was standing just a few feet away from my driver's side window, their face still obscured by the brim of the hat. They didn't move, didn't try to open the door or say anything. They just stood there, staring at me. Or at least, I think they were staring. The shadows cast by the brim of their hat made it impossible to see their eyes, but I could feel them boring into me. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the car, my entire body trembling with fear. When the engine roared to life, the figure finally moved. They didn't run or lunge at the car. Instead, they took a single step backward, then another, fading into the shadows of the unlit street. I didn't wait to see where they went. I threw the car into drive and sped off, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I didn't slow down until I was several blocks away, and even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them following me. When I got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a long time, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. My house felt too big, too empty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For weeks after that, I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I started parking closer to work, never walking alone at night, always keeping my phone in hand. The scariest part, though, came a month later. I was scrolling through the news on my phone when I saw a headline that made my blood run cold. Man arrested in connection with series of late-night attacks. The mugshot showed a man with a familiar face, broad shoulders, dark coat, baseball cap. The article detailed how he had followed women late at night, attacking them when they reached their cars. My stomach churned as I read about his victims, about how close I had come to being one of them. The thought that I had seen him, that he had been so close to me, still haunts me. Sometimes I still think about that night, about the way he had just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I wonder what would have happened if I had looked up a second later, if I hadn't made it to my car in time. And the thought that unsettles me the most is this. He wasn't some monster hiding in the shadows. He was a man, just a man, who could be anywhere, blending into the crowd. I've never walked alone at night since, and I never will again. The first time I noticed something was off, I brushed it aside. It was a Saturday evening, and we were supposed to have dinner together, something casual at home. He'd texted earlier saying he'd be late, caught up at work, but when he came through the door, there was no trace of exhaustion or stress. Instead, he was freshly showered, the faint scent of cologne trailing behind him. I asked how his day was, and he mumbled something vague about a meeting that ran late. I chalked it up to the usual grind of his job and let it go, but a small voice inside me whispered that something wasn't right. He started spending more time on his phone after that. Not the leisurely scrolling or aimless games he used to enjoy, but furtive, purposeful typing. Whenever I walked into the room, he'd lower the screen slightly, angling it away from me. When I'd ask who he was texting, he'd laugh nervously and say it was just a friend from work. The more I asked, the more irritable he became. One night, I reached over to grab his phone, teasing him about all the secrets he was keeping. He snatched it away so quickly, it startled me. "Can't I have any privacy?" he snapped. I apologized, but the moment lingered between us like a wall. He started going out more often, claiming it was work-related. Networking dinners, happy hours, late meetings. His calendar filled up with events that conveniently didn't include me. He'd come home hours after he said he would, always with a rehearsed excuse. The stories grew more detailed as the weeks passed, as if he'd practiced them in the car ride home. "We went to this little Italian place downtown," he'd say, rattling off the name of a dish he supposedly tried. But when I asked about the restaurant, his answers grew vague, the details slipping through his fingers like sand. One evening, I noticed a change in his wardrobe. He'd always been content with jeans and a t-shirt, but now he was buying slim-fit dress shirts and tailored pants. A pair of shoes so polished they reflected the light stood out starkly against the worn sneakers he used to live in. "Just trying to look the part," he said when I commented on the change. "You know how these corporate guys are." The explanation sounded plausible, but it didn't explain the way he spent extra time in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie until it was just right. The distance between us grew like a crack in a windshield, small at first but spreading rapidly. He used to call me during the day, just to say hi or share a joke, but those calls stopped. When I texted him, his replies were short, almost dismissive. "Busy," he'd say, or "Can we talk later?" Even when we were in the same room, he felt miles away. I tried to bridge the gap, suggesting date nights or weekends away, but he always had a reason to say no. "Things are crazy at work right now," he'd say. "Maybe next month." Next month turned into never. One night, he left his phone on the counter while he went to take a shower. The screen lit up with a message, just a simple, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," smiling face with smiling eyes. My stomach dropped. I told myself it could be innocent, maybe a friend or a colleague. But when I saw the name on the message, a name I didn't recognize, the doubts I'd been suppressing surged to the surface. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my mind racing with possibilities. I wanted to unlock it, to confirm what I already suspected, but guilt stopped me. Instead, I placed it back where I'd found it and waited for him to return. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering who he really was when he wasn't with me. The thought consumed me, and by morning, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I decided to confront him. I asked if there was someone else, keeping my voice steady even as my heart pounded. He looked at me, wide-eyed, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "What? No. Why would you even think that?" he said, his voice a mix of indignation and panic. But his reaction wasn't reassuring. It was defensive, almost rehearsed. Over the next few weeks, the cracks in his facade became impossible to ignore. He accused me of being paranoid, of not trusting him, of making things up in my head. "Why are you doing this?" he'd say, his voice rising. "You're pushing me away." But I wasn't the one pulling the strings. I was just trying to hold on to what was left of us. The more I tried to talk to him, the more he shut me out. His anger flared at the smallest provocations, and he began blaming me for everything that went wrong in our lives. One day, I came home to find him packing a bag. He said it was for a work trip, but the unease in my chest told me otherwise. I asked if I could come with him, thinking maybe we just needed time away from everything to reconnect. His face darkened. "You can't just drop everything and come with me," he said. "This is work, not a vacation." The sharpness in his tone cut through me, but I forced a smile and let him leave without another word. That weekend, I decided to follow him. It felt desperate, even shameful, but I needed answers. I waited outside his supposed hotel, watching as he stepped out with a woman I'd never seen before. They laughed, their bodies close, his hand brushing hers as if it belonged there. My heart shattered, the pieces scattering like glass. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I just drove home, tears blurring my vision, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a stone. When he returned, I didn't say anything. I needed time to process, to figure out what came next. But he must have sensed the shift in me, because he started acting like the man I used to know. Attentive, affectionate, full of promises he had no intention of keeping. It was too late. I'd seen the truth, and no amount of charm could erase it. The day I told him it was over, he didn't fight. He just nodded, as if he'd been expecting it all along. "I'm sorry," he said, but the words felt hollow. He packed his things and left without looking back, leaving me to pick up the pieces of the life we'd built together. It's been years now, and while the pain has faded, the scars remain. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to the whispers of doubt before they grow into roars. And most of all, I've learned that love without honesty is no love at all. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my favorite corner booth at a small cafe near my apartment, sipping a latte and flipping through a book. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of regulars and a man I'd never seen before seated 2 tables away. He was unremarkable, mid-30s, brown hair, glasses, but something about the way he kept glancing at me caught my attention. Each time I looked up, his eyes darted away as if I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't. I brushed it off. Maybe he thought he recognized me, or was just awkward around strangers. It happens. A few days later, I was at the grocery store after work. My mind was on autopilot as I moved through the aisles, grabbing items for dinner, until I turned a corner and saw him again. The same man from the cafe. This time, he was standing in front of the cereal section, staring blankly at the shelves. He didn't seem to notice me, and I told myself it was just a coincidence. People have to eat, after all. But when I passed him again in the frozen foods aisle and caught him watching me out of the corner of his eye, my stomach sank. He quickly turned his back and pretended to examine a bag of peas, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. Still, I reasoned that I was being paranoid and brushed it off. The next week, I was walking my dog, Max, at the park. It was a sunny afternoon, and the trails were busy with joggers, families, and other dog walkers. Max tugged me toward the pond, and that's when I saw him again. He was sitting on a bench, wearing sunglasses and holding a newspaper, which he wasn't reading. His head turned slightly as I walked past, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze. My skin prickled with unease. I considered leaving the park altogether, but Max was enjoying himself, and I didn't want to cut our outing short over a hunch. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder, and every time I did, he seemed to have shifted closer. First, he was on the bench. Then, he was leaning against a tree near the path I'd taken. Finally, as I made my way back to the parking lot, he was by the entrance, pretending to check his phone. That night, I lay awake replaying every interaction. Could it really be a coincidence? Maybe he lived in my neighborhood, or maybe we just frequented the same places. But 3 times in such a short span felt deliberate. I told myself I'd imagine the looks, the subtle movements closer to where I was. I convinced myself I was overreacting. After all, he hadn't done anything overtly threatening. What was I supposed to do? Report a man for existing in the same spaces as me? A week went by without seeing him, and I started to relax. Maybe he was just a stranger whose presence I'd overanalyzed. Then, one night, I came home late from work and found a small note tucked into my apartment doorframe. My name was written on the front in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. My heart raced as I unfolded it, but all it said was, "You forgot this." Inside was a receipt from the grocery store, one of mine, from 2 weeks ago. My first instinct was to laugh. I must have dropped it on my way home, and some kind neighbor thought they were being helpful. But as I stood there holding the note, dread crept in. How would they know which door was mine? And why now, after 2 weeks? I double-checked that my door was locked and spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment blazing. Max barked at the window once, but when I peeked through the blinds, no one was there. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building made me flinch, and my mind kept circling back to the man from the cafe, the store, the park. Could he have followed me home? Was this his way of letting me know? But why not just knock or say something if he wanted to return the receipt? Why leave a cryptic note? The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I went to work and tried to focus on the endless emails and meetings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. By the time I got home, my nerves were fried, and I was ready to collapse. I was halfway up the stairs to my apartment when I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, echoing in the stairwell. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds until I was safely inside. Days turned into weeks, and I saw him less frequently, but that only made the moments when he did appear more jarring. Once, I was leaving a friend's house late at night when I noticed him standing across the street under a broken street lamp. Another time, I spotted him sitting in a car outside my office as I left for lunch. Each time, he seemed to vanish before I could confront him. I started feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. Was he really there? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I confided in a couple of friends, but they either shrugged it off as a series of coincidences or told me to call the police. What could I even report? A man who keeps showing up but doesn't actually do anything? Then, last night, I came home to find my door unlocked. I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. No sign of a break-in. Max was his usual cheerful self, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. On the kitchen counter was a single item I hadn't left out. My book from the cafe, the one I hadn't seen in weeks. The receipt from the grocery store was tucked neatly inside as a bookmark. I don't know what to do. My friends say I'm imagining things, that I've probably misplaced the book and forgotten about it. But I know what I've seen, what I've felt. Is it all just an eerie series of coincidences? Or is someone out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to make their next move? It started with the socks. Not the mismatched, perpetually disappearing kind that vanish in the wash, but the ones I knew I put away in pairs. One morning, while getting ready for work, I opened my drawer to find half my collection gone. I told myself I was being scatterbrained, that I'd forgotten to do laundry or left them elsewhere. It wasn't until I found a single sock in my kitchen sink later that evening that I paused. Why was it there? I lived alone, and as much as I tried to rationalize it, maybe it stuck to a dish towel in the laundry, I couldn't shake the oddness. The next few weeks were a cascade of minor, but puzzling events. A mug I swore I left on the counter reappeared in my bathroom cabinet. A book I hadn't read in years showed up on my nightstand, its pages dog-eared as though someone had been flipping through it. My keys would occasionally go missing, only to turn up in places I knew I hadn't been. The freezer, under my bed, once even outside on the porch. I laughed it off at first. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I joked to friends over drinks. They laughed with me, and that laughter felt good. It made me think, briefly, that I was overthinking everything. But then came the marks. The first time I noticed them, I was dusting a shelf near my front door. Faint scratches in the wood, almost like claw marks. I figured it was wear and tear, nothing more. A few days later, though, I found similar scratches on the wall next to my bed. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate. 3 parallel lines, evenly spaced. That was when the anxiety started creeping in. I bought a small camera, the kind you can stick in the corner of a room to monitor things. I told myself it was for peace of mind, that I just needed to see myself misplacing things so I could stop obsessing over it. The first night, I set it up in my bedroom. When I woke up the next morning, I hesitated before checking the footage. The idea of finding nothing somehow felt worse than finding something. At first, the video showed exactly what I expected. Me sleeping soundly, tossing and turning every now and then, but around 3:12 a.m., the camera's frame jittered briefly. It wasn't much, just a flicker, as though someone had bumped it. Then, a shadow passed through the bottom edge of the frame. It was quick, a blur, but unmistakably there. My stomach tightened as I rewound the footage and slowed it down. The shadow didn't resemble anything in my room. It moved unnaturally, too smooth, too fast. I told myself it must have been a bug on the lens, or maybe a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. After that, I began to notice the noises. At first, I chalked them up to an old house settling. Faint creaks in the floorboards, the occasional thud in the walls. But then they became harder to dismiss. One night, while brushing my teeth, I heard something behind me. A faint, raspy sound, like breathing. I spun around, toothpaste foaming in my mouth, but the bathroom was empty. Another time, I woke up to a soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. It was coming from inside my closet. My heart pounded as I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I yanked it open, only to find nothing but my neatly hung clothes and a pile of shoes. The scratches grew worse. They appeared on the doors, the furniture, even my skin. I woke one morning to find 3 red welts on my forearm, perfectly aligned. They didn't hurt, but their symmetry made my stomach churn. I tried talking to friends about it, but their reactions ranged from amused skepticism to concerned dismissal. "Maybe you should see someone," one suggested delicately. I wanted to scream. How could they not understand? Something was happening to me. The final straw came on a night when I couldn't sleep. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't coming from outside or the neighbor's apartment. It was inside the room. My chest tightened as I strained to make out the words. They were garbled, almost like a recording played backward. But one word came through clearly: leave. The next morning, I decided to check the camera footage again. I felt a sinking dread as I scrolled through hours of uneventful video, dreading what I might find. And then, at 2:47 a.m., the screen went black. When the image returned, the camera was no longer in its original position. Instead, it was angled downward, as though someone had picked it up and placed it on the floor. In the center of the frame was a pair of footprints, small, muddy, and leading away from the bed. I moved out the next day, leaving behind everything but the essentials. I didn't tell the landlord about the scratches or the noises. I just handed over the keys and drove as far as I could before pulling into a cheap motel. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks. But when I woke up, I noticed something on the nightstand. A single sock, folded neatly. It wasn't mine. It started as an unremarkable Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk, finishing a dull quarterly report for work. The blinds on the window were half closed, casting stripes of light across the room. My cat, Baxter, was sprawled on the carpet, lazily swatting at a crumpled receipt I dropped. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and everything felt perfectly ordinary until it didn't. At first, it was just a flicker of strangeness. I glanced at the clock, 2:37 p.m. When I looked back, it was 2:34. I blinked, chalking it up to a momentary lapse. Maybe I'd misread it. I adjusted my chair and kept typing, but the feeling lingered like the faint hum of a faraway engine, just barely noticeable but impossible to ignore. Then, as I reached for my coffee mug, it wasn't where I'd left it. It had been on the right side of my keyboard a minute ago. I was sure of it, but now it was on the left. Baxter meowed suddenly, startling me. His eyes locked on the mug as if he'd noticed too. I picked it up, felt its reassuring weight in my hand, and dismissed the thought. Maybe I had moved it absent-mindedly. But things didn't stop there. A while later, as I stretched and leaned back in my chair, I caught sight of the receipt Baxter had been playing with. Except, now there were 2 receipts. Identical in size, crumpled just the same way. I stared at them, and the rational part of my brain scrambled for answers. Maybe I dropped another without noticing. Baxter, unbothered, pawed at one before losing interest entirely. The strangeness began to compound. Around 3:10 p.m., I heard a faint buzzing sound. I thought it was my phone vibrating on the table, but when I checked, the screen was dark. The sound persisted, faint but constant, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The blinds shifted slightly as if brushed by a breeze, but the window was closed. The air felt heavy, like a thunderstorm was about to break, but the sky outside was cloudless and bright. At 3:17 p.m., my computer screen glitched. The display froze for a second, then pixelated into a pattern of black and green lines before returning to normal. I muttered a curse under my breath and rebooted it. While I waited, I grabbed my phone to scroll through emails, only to find that it was 2:37 p.m. again. My stomach lurched. I stared at the screen, blinking hard, then checked my wall clock. It, too, read 2:37. I stood up, heart thumping, and walked to the kitchen to splash some water on my face. Maybe I was overworked, stressed out. I leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Everything seemed normal until I heard the faint buzzing again. It was louder now, almost like static, and seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and turned around. Baxter was sitting in the doorway, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. When I walked back to my desk, I noticed something that made my breath hitch. The receipts, both of them, were gone. In their place was a single sheet of paper, blank and unmarked. I hadn't put it there. I was sure of that. My computer had finished rebooting, and the clock in the corner of the screen now read 4:02 p.m. Hadn't it just been 2:37? My head throbbed. I tried to focus, to convince myself this was all in my mind, but the details didn't add up. By 4:15 p.m., I was beginning to panic. The buzzing noise had become a low hum, vibrating in my bones. Baxter refused to leave my side, his tail twitching like he was agitated by something I couldn't see. I tried calling a friend, but the line didn't connect. I tried emailing my boss, but my screen froze again. This time, the glitch was worse. The display flickered violently before showing something that made my stomach twist. My desktop background was replaced by an image of my own living room. The angle was strange, like it was being viewed through a fisheye lens. I turned my head sharply toward the window, half expecting to see a camera or a drone. There was nothing, just the stillness of the empty street below. But when I looked back at the screen, the image was gone. My desktop was back, as if nothing had happened. I thought about leaving the house, stepping outside for air, but something about the idea filled me with dread. The world beyond the window felt off, like a poorly constructed set where nothing quite fit together. The colors of the sky seemed too vivid, the shadows too sharp. I noticed the neighbor's car across the street was parked at an impossible angle, its front tires almost grazing the curb, its back tires still perfectly aligned with the road. At 5:03 p.m., the buzzing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. The kind of silence where you can hear your own blood rushing in your ears. Baxter bolted from the room, disappearing under the bed, and I was left alone. My phone buzzed. A notification. I grabbed it eagerly, desperate for some kind of connection to reality, but the screen displayed a message that wasn't in any app I'd ever seen. Do not leave. It's not ready yet. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My hands trembled. My mind raced. What wasn't ready? Who was sending this? I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls closer. The air seemed to vibrate again, though there was no sound. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the phone, waiting for something to happen. The clock ticked, the minutes stretched, but time itself felt meaningless. When I finally gathered the courage to pick up the phone, the message was gone. The clock on my screen read 2:37 p.m. again. I'm writing this now, hours later, or maybe it's still the same moment, looping endlessly. I'm not sure what's real anymore. Baxter hasn't come out from under the bed. The buzzing has started again, faint but insistent, like it's inside my head. Every so often, I glance at the window, half expecting to see something staring back. So far, there's nothing, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that reality itself has slipped, and I've fallen into the cracks. I don't know what will happen when it's ready, but I don't think I want to find out. I remember the sound of the snow crunching under my boots that night, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the oppressive silence around me. It was colder than usual for early January, the kind of cold that gnawed through layers and made your breath hang in the air like ghostly whispers. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only a heavy gray sky overhead. I shouldn't have been there. I knew that from the moment I parked my car at the end of the long, dark driveway. My sister's house loomed at the far end, an unsettling silhouette against the fading light. I could feel something watching me even then, though I couldn't see anything through the dense forest that lined the path. The phone call had been abrupt and unsettling, her voice shaking like a loose window in a storm. I need you to come over. Right now. Please. No context, no explanation, just those few words before the line went dead. By the time I arrived, her car was gone, and the house stood silent. The driveway was coated in a fresh layer of snow, unbroken except for my own tire tracks. I knocked on the door once, twice, 3 times, the sound echoing into the night. No answer. I fumbled under the doormat and found the spare key, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. Inside, the house was dark and heavy, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of every breath you take. The air smelled faintly of something burnt, and a trail of wet footprints led from the door to the staircase. They weren't mine. I called out her name, my voice cracking in the stillness. No response. My eyes followed the footprints, hesitating only a moment before I began climbing the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound ricocheting off the walls. At the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, but only one room had light spilling out from beneath the door, her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint flicker of a lamp danced across the floorboards. My fingers brushed against the doorframe as I pushed it open, the cold wood grounding me for a fleeting moment. Her room was empty, but the scene before me was anything but ordinary. Deep scratches marred the floor, forming strange, jagged patterns around the bed. The lamp on her nightstand flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. On the bed lay her phone, buzzing softly with an incoming message. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I read the words on the screen. "Get out." I froze, the weight of the message sinking into my chest like a stone. Before I could react, the lamp sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned toward the door, only to feel a sudden, suffocating presence behind me. I didn't dare look back. The air grew thick, almost liquid, and an overwhelming sense of dread rooted me to the spot. The faint sound of breathing, low and ragged, brushed against the back of my neck. It wasn't mine. Adrenaline surged through me, and I bolted for the hallway, nearly tripping over the threshold in my haste. The moment I was out of the room, the oppressive feeling lifted. But the house seemed darker, colder, as if whatever was in that room had spread like a shadow creeping through the walls. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. The screen lit up, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I stumbled down the stairs, my breath hitching with every step. As I reached the living room, I heard it. The faint creak of floorboards above me, slow and deliberate, as if something was pacing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, what I'd felt, but there was no logic to be found. I reached the front door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. Relief flooded through me as I stepped outside, but it was short-lived. The footprints in the snow were gone. Not just hers, mine too. The driveway was pristine, untouched, as if I had never been there. Panic clawed at my chest, and I turned back to the house, hoping to see some sign of my sister, some explanation for what was happening. Instead, I saw movement in the upstairs window. A figure, tall and indistinct, stood in her room, silhouetted by the faint glow of the flickering lamp. It wasn't her. The figure turned slowly, its movements unnaturally fluid, and I swear it was looking straight at me despite the distance. My legs moved before my brain could process what I was doing, carrying me back to my car. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and I backed out of the driveway so fast I nearly hit a tree. My headlights briefly illuminated the house, and that's when I saw it. The figure was no longer in the window. It was standing on the porch, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. My tires spun on the icy road as I floored the gas, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. I don't remember how long I drove or where I went. When I finally stopped, the sun was beginning to rise, its weak light chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. I sat there in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, replaying the events over and over in my mind. My sister was never found. The police said there was no sign of a struggle, no evidence she'd been home at all. Her car was discovered weeks later, abandoned miles away, but there was no trace of her. Sometimes, late at night, I still see that figure in my dreams. It stands at the foot of my bed, watching, waiting, just like it did that night. I don't know what it wants, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that I wasn't supposed to leave. It started with little things. At first, I didn't think much of it. Why would I? Everyone misplaces their keys or forgets what they came into a room for. It wasn't until the night I woke up sitting in my living room, staring at the blank TV screen, that I felt the first ripple of unease. My legs were folded beneath me in a way I never sit, and the remote was clutched in my hand, though the TV wasn't on. The clock said 2:14 a.m., and I couldn't remember getting out of bed. I chalked it up to a bad dream and shuffled back to bed. But it wasn't a dream. Not really. The next morning, I found my shoes lined up neatly by the front door, not kicked off by the mat where I usually left them. The pantry door was open, and an empty glass was sitting on the counter. None of that was particularly alarming, but I knew I hadn't done those things. I lived alone. I told myself I must have been groggy the night before and forgotten. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was wrong. It was like I was trying to convince myself it was fine more than I actually believed it. Days passed, and the strangeness escalated. I started noticing gaps, chunks of time where I couldn't account for what I'd been doing. I'd sit down to write an email, and then suddenly, an hour was gone, and I'd be standing in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I started keeping a journal, hoping I could pinpoint when these lapses were happening, but my notes didn't help. I'd write something down, only to read it later and feel like I hadn't written it at all. The handwriting was mine, but the words didn't feel like they belonged to me. They felt foreign, like they'd been put there by someone else. One evening, I bumped into my neighbor in the hallway of my apartment building. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Oh, there you are. I was just telling Jake how nice it was of you to stop by yesterday. Thanks for the cookies, by the way. They were delicious." Her smile was warm, genuine, and completely disarming. But I hadn't stopped by her apartment. I hadn't made cookies. I mumbled something about being glad she liked them and hurried back to my place, my heart pounding in my chest. Who had she talked to? What was happening? I started to notice other inconsistencies. My coworkers would reference conversations I didn't remember having. My best friend, Emily, texted me to ask if I was feeling better and said I'd sounded off during our phone call the night before. I hadn't called Emily. At least, I didn't think I had. But when I checked my phone, there it was, a 23-minute call to her at 11:47 p.m. I didn't even remember being awake at that time. The worst part was that everyone around me seemed perfectly normal. It was as if they didn't notice anything strange about my behavior, even as I felt like I was slowly unraveling. I started isolating myself, afraid to talk to anyone, afraid of what they might say I'd done or said. My apartment became my sanctuary, though even there, I couldn't escape the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I'd wake up to find my desk chair turned toward the bed, as if someone had been sitting there, watching me sleep. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, just at the edge of hearing, too soft to make out. The tipping point came on a Sunday night. I had barricaded myself in my apartment for the entire weekend, desperate to regain some sense of control. I turned off my phone and ignored the knocks on my door. I was determined to stay awake, to stay aware. Around midnight, I glanced at the clock. It read 12:03 a.m. I blinked, and suddenly, it was 4:17 a.m., and I was standing in the kitchen with a knife in my hand. The blade was clean, but the counter was littered with deep gouges, as if I'd been carving into it. My journal was open on the table, filled with page after page of frantic scrawling in my handwriting. The words made no sense. Nonsensical phrases and half-formed sentences, repeated over and over. I finally caved and called Emily. I didn't tell her everything, just that I wasn't feeling well and needed someone to talk to. She came over within the hour, and for a while, it was comforting to have someone there. But then, as she spoke, I noticed something. Her voice seemed wrong, like it was slightly out of sync with her lips. Her laughter didn't sound like hers. When I pointed it out, she frowned and asked if I was okay. I tried to shake it off, but the more I looked at her, the more I felt like she wasn't really Emily at all. The way she moved, the way she smiled, It was all just a little off. When she left, I was more terrified than ever. I began to question everything, every interaction, every memory. How could I trust that any of it was real? How could I even trust myself? That night, I dreamt, or maybe I didn't, that I was standing in my bedroom, staring at myself lying in bed. The me in the bed looked peaceful, but the me standing there felt cold, detached, and other. I reached out to touch my sleeping face, and just as my fingers brushed my cheek, I woke up gasping for air. I've stopped trying to figure it out. There are days where I feel like myself, like everything is normal, but those days are becoming fewer. More often, I feel like a passenger in my own body, watching as someone, or something, lives my life for me. I've considered seeing a doctor, but every time I pick up the phone, I find myself putting it down again, as if the thought of getting help isn't really mine. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of myself in reflective surfaces, and for a split second, my reflection doesn't move the way I do. It smiles when I'm not smiling. It looks at me like it knows something I don't. I don't know what's real anymore. All I know is that whatever's happening, it isn't over. And the worst part? I don't think it ever will be. It started when I moved into the new apartment. It wasn't a special place, just a standard one-bedroom on the edge of the city with creaky floorboards and a view of a gray parking lot. The landlord, a wiry man named Pete, handed me the keys with a toothy grin and said, "Welcome to your new home. Quiet neighborhood, friendly folks." It sounded promising, and at first it was. Until it wasn't. The first oddity happened a week after I moved in. I was unpacking late at night, my Spotify playlist humming softly in the background, when I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't aggressive, but persistent, a steady tap tap tap. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it felt strange for a neighborly introduction to happen at nearly 11 p.m. Still, I opened the door. A man stood there, tall and broad, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He held a loaf of bread in one hand. "Welcome to the building," he said in a gravelly voice, thrusting the bread at me. "It's homemade, from me and my wife." I hesitated but took it. "Thanks," I said, managing an awkward smile. He nodded, then walked off down the hall without another word. The bread was stale, but I didn't think much of it at the time. It was the first of many small, strange interactions that I tried to rationalize. The next day, while walking to my car, I passed an elderly woman in the hallway. She wore a thick scarf despite the warm weather and had an odd way of staring just past me, like she didn't want to meet my eyes. "You'll want to keep your curtains closed at night," she murmured, stopping abruptly as I passed her. I froze for a moment, then turned to respond, but she was already shuffling away. I chalked it up to harmless eccentricity and carried on with my day. But over the next few weeks, the unease began to build. I'd noticed my mailbox open when I was sure I had closed it. Once, I found a sticky note on my front door that simply read, "We see you." I assumed it was a prank, probably some bored kid in the building. But that night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard shuffling outside my window. I lived on the 3rd floor. By the 3rd week, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. No matter where I was, in my apartment, in the parking lot, even at the grocery store, I'd feel eyes on me. Once, I caught a reflection in the store's freezer glass. A man, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, staring at me from behind a stack of canned goods. When I turned, he was gone. I started noticing patterns in the people around me, too. The same faces always lingered in the communal spaces. A man in a plaid jacket who smoked near the dumpsters every morning, always looking up at my balcony. A young woman with dark, sunken eyes who paced the hallway outside my door late at night. They all acted as if they didn't see me when I tried to engage, but I'd catch them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Things escalated when I found the pictures. I was heading out to work one morning and noticed something sticking out of my windshield wiper. It was an envelope, thick and heavy, with no return address. Inside were half a dozen photographs of me, taken from different angles, at different times. One showed me on my balcony with a mug of coffee. Another was of me sleeping in bed, my curtains half open. My heart raced as I flipped through them, the air growing colder with each image. The final one was of my front door, taken from the hallway. Written across the photo in shaky handwriting were the words, "Do you trust them?" I didn't know who they were, but paranoia seeped into every corner of my life. I stopped sleeping and began triple-checking my locks. I started carrying pepper spray everywhere I went. I tried to contact the landlord to ask about the building's security, but every time I called, it went to voicemail. When I stopped by his office, it was locked and dark, as though no one had been there in weeks. I decided to do some digging on my own. I asked around the building, but most of the residents seemed either indifferent or annoyed by my questions. The elderly woman who had warned me about the curtains only muttered something cryptic about keeping the balance before scurrying away. I eventually found an old man on the first floor who had lived in the building for decades. "This place has rules," he said, leaning heavily on a cane. "Keep your head down. Don't ask too many questions. People who don't follow the rules, they disappear." "What do you mean, disappear?" I asked, my voice shaking. He just shook his head and refused to say more. That night, I bolted every lock and sat in the dark with a kitchen knife, listening to every creak and groan of the building. Around 3 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't steady. It was frantic, pounding. I approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The knocking stopped and a muffled voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." My stomach dropped and I backed away from the door, clutching the knife. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed as much as I could into my car and headed to a friend's place across town. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. The man in the baseball cap was standing in the window of my apartment, staring down at me. His face was blank, devoid of any emotion, and he wasn't alone. The elderly woman and the girl with the sunken eyes were there too, all watching as I drove away. I never went back to that apartment. I never even went back to that side of town. But sometimes, I still feel like I'm being watched on the train, at the coffee shop, in my own bedroom. And every now and then, I find a sticky note in places it shouldn't be, always with the same message, "We see you." The first thing I noticed was the window. My bedroom window faced east, overlooking the old oak tree that had stood guard over our cul-de-sac for decades. Every morning, the sunlight would filter through its branches, painting dappled shadows on my walls. But one morning, the shadows were wrong. They weren't soft and diffused. They were sharp, almost jagged, like the branches had grown thorns overnight. I brushed it off, thinking it was my sleep-addled brain playing tricks. But when I glanced at the oak, it didn't look the same. The bark, usually rough and knotted, seemed unnaturally smooth, and the leaves, weren't they always green? Now they shimmered an odd gray, as though dusted with ash. I told myself I was imagining things and went about my day, but I couldn't shake the unease. At work, people seemed off. My coworker Jenna, who always wore a gold locket with a picture of her kids, now had a plain silver chain around her neck. When I casually asked about the locket, she frowned and said she'd never owned one. Her tone was curt, almost defensive, as if I'd accused her of something. Then there was Brian, who usually greeted me with a cheesy dad joke. That day, he just stared at me for a moment too long, his lips twitching like he was trying to remember how to smile. By the time I got home, my nerves were raw. I locked the door, something I never did, and checked all the windows. They looked normal, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was watching me. I tried to distract myself with TV, but the sitcom I always watched felt different. The characters were the same, but the jokes fell flat, the laugh track grating like nails on a chalkboard. And the main character, Greg, kept glancing at the camera, his eyes lingering too long, like he was staring directly at me. The changes started piling up after that. My favorite coffee shop replaced their familiar green mugs with pale blue ones. The barista, who had always called me Han, now just nodded silently when I placed my order. One day, I saw a woman in the corner booth, her face buried in a book. She looked exactly like my old high school friend, Emily, except Emily had died in a car crash 5 years ago. I froze, staring at her. She glanced up and smiled politely, her face a perfect replica of Emily's, down to the tiny scar above her left eyebrow. My stomach churned, and I rushed out without picking up my coffee. When I mentioned it to my best friend, Mia, she laughed it off. "You're just stressed," she said, her voice unnervingly flat. "You've been working too hard." Her expression didn't match her words. Her eyes were cold, distant, as if she didn't really believe what she was saying. Or maybe she didn't care. I couldn't tell anymore. The final straw came 2 nights later. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the wrongness of the shadows on my wall, when I heard the faint creak of floorboards outside my room. My heart jumped into my throat. I live alone. I grabbed my phone and crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. The creaking stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the tapping continued, echoing faintly from the living room. I tiptoed toward the sound, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I rounded the corner, I froze. A man was sitting on my couch. His back was to me, and he was tapping his fingers against the armrest in perfect rhythm. He was wearing a crisp gray suit, the kind you'd see on a businessman, but his head was slightly tilted, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. Slowly, he turned his head, and my stomach dropped. His face was featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over a blank canvas. I stumbled back, slamming into the wall. My phone slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. When I looked up, he was gone. The police didn't believe me when I called. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" the officer asked, his tone skeptical. "They sent someone to check the house, but of course, they found nothing." After that night, the changes became more drastic. The oak tree outside my window disappeared entirely, replaced by a towering pine that I'd never seen before. The streetlights cast a strange, bluish glow, and the air felt heavier, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. My neighbors, once friendly and chatty, now avoided me. I saw them whispering to each other when they thought I wasn't looking, their eyes flicking toward me with expressions I couldn't decipher. I started keeping a journal, trying to document every change, every anomaly, but even the journal betrayed me. One day, I flipped back to read my earlier entries and found the pages filled with strange symbols instead of my handwriting. Intricate, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when I stared at them too long. Desperate, I reached out to my mom. She was my last anchor to reality, the one person I thought I could trust. But when I visited her, she seemed different too. Her movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and she kept calling me by my middle name, a name she hadn't used since I was a child. Her house, once warm and familiar, felt sterile, like a stage set. The family photos on the mantel showed people I didn't recognize. When I pointed this out, she just smiled and said, "You're imagining things, sweetie. Everything's exactly as it should be." I stopped sleeping. Every creak, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. The world around me had become a distorted reflection of itself, a funhouse mirror version that only I could see. I tried to leave town, thinking a change of scenery might help, but no matter how far I drove, I always ended up back in my driveway. Now, as I write this, I'm not even sure if this message will reach anyone. My phone, my laptop, they've started glitching, the screen flickering with static and those same shifting symbols. If you're reading this, please tell me, do you see the changes too? Or am I the only one trapped in this place, where everything looks normal but feels impossibly wrong? I don't think I'm alone anymore, but the things here, they're not people. Not really. And I'm terrified that soon, I won't be either. When I moved into the little duplex at the end of Brookhaven Street, I wasn't looking for much. Cheap rent, a place close to work, and no roommates. After years of splitting bills and sharing bathrooms, the idea of having my own place, however small, was all I wanted. It wasn't fancy, cracked linoleum in the kitchen, a living room that smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many candles I burned, but it was mine. The landlord, Mr. Garvey, had mentioned that the last tenant had moved out in a rush, but I didn't think much of it. People leave places all the time. Sometimes life just happens. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked a few boxes, threw some frozen pizza in the oven, and binge-watched some crime show until I dozed off on the couch. Around 3 a.m., I woke to what I thought was the sound of footsteps above me. My half-asleep brain reasoned it was just the other half of the duplex. Thin walls, shared spaces, you know how it is. But then I remembered the other unit was empty. Mr. Garvey had been clear about that when I asked if I'd have neighbors. I sat there for a moment, ears straining against the silence, until the noise stopped. Maybe it had been the house settling. Old places make sounds. That's all it was. The second night, I heard it again. It started as a faint creak, the kind you'd barely notice unless you were already listening for it. Then came the heavier sounds, deliberate and slow, as though someone was walking from one end of the upstairs unit to the other. I stared at the ceiling, counting the steps. They stopped right above my bedroom. I held my breath, waiting for... what? A knock? A voice? Something. But there was only silence. By the third night, I was starting to feel paranoid. The footsteps came again, always at the same time, always stopping in the same spot above my bed. This time, I decided to investigate. Armed with my phone flashlight and a baseball bat I found in the storage closet, I stepped outside and walked around to the other side of the duplex. The curtains in the upstairs window were drawn, but the faint outline of a figure stood just behind the fabric. My heart shot to my throat. I don't remember consciously deciding to move, but suddenly I was running back to my side of the house, locking the door behind me. I called Mr. Garvey the next morning. "I thought you said the other unit was empty," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He assured me it was. In fact, he hadn't rented it out in months, not since the last tenant had broken their lease without notice. "Probably just your imagination," he chuckled. "Old houses play tricks on you. You'll get used to it." I didn't tell him about the shadow in the window. I didn't want to sound crazy. That day, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. It was dark, the curtains had been swaying in the breeze, and I'd let my mind run wild. But that night, the footsteps came again, louder than before. This time, they didn't stop above my bed. Instead, they made their way down the stairs to the shared wall between the two units. I swear I could hear faint breathing through the plaster. I pressed my ear against the wall, and for a moment, it felt like the person on the other side was doing the same. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then there was a knock, 3 soft, deliberate raps. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of my rug, and the sound stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to look into the history of the duplex. The local library had a tiny archive of old newspapers, and it didn't take long to find something about the house. In 1987, a man named Victor Lowell had been found dead in the upstairs unit. The details were sparse, but the article mentioned he'd been living there alone. No signs of forced entry. No suspects. The coroner had ruled it a homicide, but there were no further updates. Victor Lowell had faded into the town's history as just another unsolved case. I was spooked, sure, but that didn't explain the footsteps. Dead people don't walk around, and they definitely don't knock on walls. I kept telling myself that. I even went so far as to put up motion-activated cameras in my living room and bedroom. If someone, or something, was messing with me, I was going to catch them in the act. The cameras didn't help. Every night, the footsteps came, and every morning, I checked the footage to find nothing but static from the exact moments the sounds occurred. By the 5th night, I was at my wit's end. That's when I decided to go upstairs. The door to the other unit was unlocked. It swung open with a groan, revealing a space that looked frozen in time. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room. I walked through the kitchen, the living room, and finally up the stairs to the bedroom directly above mine. The air was colder here, sharp and biting. The curtains were still drawn, just as I'd seen them before. I hesitated for a long moment before pulling them back. The window was covered in thick scratches, as though someone had clawed at the glass from the inside. My stomach churned as I noticed something else. A set of faint footprints in the dust leading from the window to the door. They didn't match mine. They were smaller, like a child's. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and that's when I heard it. A voice, faint and raspy, whispering my name. "Get out." I didn't wait to find out who or what was speaking. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the door behind me as I stumbled outside. I haven't been back inside since that night. My stuff is still there, and I've made peace with losing it. I tried to tell Mr. Garvey what happened, but he just gave me that same laugh, the one that made me feel like I was crazy. I even called the cops, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no scratches, nothing. The duplex is just an empty house now. Except it isn't. Not really. I don't know what's up there, and I'm not sure I want to. But every once in a while, when I drive by Brookhaven Street, I see that upstairs window. The curtains are still drawn, and sometimes, just for a moment, I swear I see a shadow standing behind them. It all started at the cafe near my new apartment. I just moved to a quieter part of town, desperate to get away from the constant noise and congestion of the city center. The cafe was small, charming, and cozy, a perfect spot to decompress after unpacking. That's where I met him. He stood in front of me in line, holding a copy of The Stranger by Camus, a favorite of mine. He caught me looking and turned, flashing a polite smile. "You've read it?" he asked, his voice friendly but not overly familiar. I nodded, and before I knew it, we were talking. His name was Adam, and he had a warm, approachable demeanor. He told me he'd just moved to the area too, and suggested a few local spots he'd stumbled upon. We ended up sitting at separate tables, but he waved as he left, and I thought nothing of it. The next time I saw him was at the park a week later. I was jogging, and there he was, sitting on a bench, feeding pigeons. He called out, "Hey, neighbor," with the same easygoing smile, and I stopped to say hello. We chatted briefly. He remembered my name, which felt nice since I'd completely blanked on his until that moment. "Small world," he said, gesturing at the park. It did feel like a coincidence. Innocuous, really. I didn't think much of it. Over the next few weeks, I started running into Adam more often. At the grocery store, on the subway, and once even outside my building as he walked a dog I hadn't seen before. Each time, he was friendly, casual, and seemingly harmless. But little things started to nag at me. He always seemed to know things he shouldn't. For instance, he asked if I'd found the local bakery yet, even though I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Another time, he commented on my work commute, describing the exact route I took, down to the fact I stopped at the bookstore by the station. It was strange, but I rationalized it. Maybe I'd mentioned something in passing and forgotten. Maybe he'd seen me at the bookstore and it just clicked. Then came the night I couldn't brush it off. It was late, and I'd gone out for a drink with a coworker. When I got off the subway, the street was eerily quiet. As I rounded the corner toward my building, I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Adam. Relief and confusion flooded me simultaneously. "Adam?" I called out, my voice shaky. He jogged up to me, slightly out of breath. "I saw you on the train," he said, his tone casual, as though this was completely normal. "It's late. Thought I'd make sure you got home okay." Something in the way he said it made my skin crawl. I hadn't seen him on the train, and I was sure he hadn't been in my car. Still, I thanked him and hurried inside, double-locking the door. That night, I barely slept, replaying the encounter in my head. After that, I started noticing him everywhere. At the library when I was returning books, at a new coffee shop I decided to try on a whim, even at the gym I just signed up for. Each time, he acted like it was a happy accident. "Looks like we've got similar taste," he'd joke, but his smile didn't seem as warm anymore. It felt calculated. One evening, I decided to test a theory. I made up my mind to visit a little diner on the other side of town, a place so out of the way I couldn't imagine anyone just stumbling upon it. I didn't tell a soul, didn't post about it, didn't even look it up on my phone in case he'd somehow hacked it. When I arrived, the diner was quiet, just a couple of patrons and a bored-looking server. I ordered a coffee and settled into a booth, scanning the room every so often. Just as I was starting to relax, the bell above the door jingled. It was Adam. He froze when he saw me, just for a second, and then broke into that same practiced grin. "Wow," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "We keep running into each other, huh?" I nodded, my heart pounding. I wanted to confront him, to ask how he could possibly have known I'd be there, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I mumbled an excuse about needing to go and left in a rush. From the window, I saw him watch me leave. I stopped going to my usual spots after that. I avoided the park, skipped the cafe, and changed my grocery store. But he still found me. At work, my manager handed me a letter one afternoon. No return address, just my name on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line: "You can't hide forever." My stomach dropped. I didn't tell my coworkers. What could I even say? Instead, I started looking over my shoulder constantly, keeping my phone in my hand at all times, and trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. The final straw came one night when I was home. I was in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, when a notification popped up, a photo attachment from an unknown number. I hesitated, then opened it. It was a picture of me, taken that night, through my bedroom window. My blood ran cold. I immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. I installed new locks, bought blackout curtains, and even took a few days off work to stay with a friend. The following week, I saw a moving truck outside Adam's building. I watched from my window as he loaded boxes into it, whistling to himself. I wanted to believe it was over, that he was finally gone. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be back. To this day, I don't know how he knew so much about me. I've gone over every interaction, every possibility, and still come up empty. Was he stalking me? Or was it all just some series of bizarre coincidences? Either way, I haven't felt safe since, and I probably never will. Adam, let's not meet again.